Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world of velvet gowns, whispered names in candlelit corridors, and the kinds of secrets that didn't just risk a broken heart, but a broken neck. This isn't your average royal history. Tonight, it's about queens, not just crown-wearing, banquet-throwing queens, but the ones who sidestepped rules carved in stone, tiptoed around betrayal, and still managed to get exactly what they wanted, sometimes in bed, sometimes in battle, and sometimes both. These are the women who didn't just wear the crown, they broke it in. Now just a quick reality check. You probably won't survive this. And I don't mean because of the juicy drama, although let's be honest, it's decadent. I mean because surviving court life in the age of arranged marriages, poisonings, and politics disguised as dancing was practically impossible. Yet somehow these queens did it and got away with their clandestine flings. Some even thrived. Of course, not all love stories end with flowers and violins. Sometimes they end with exile, scandal, or a very sharp axe, but that's later. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Trust me, we've got a long night ahead. Also, drop your city and time in the comments. I want to know what corner of the world you're relaxing in as we unroll these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts like this. You're walking down a long stone corridor. The torches on the wall flicker, sending dancing shadows over a silk tapestry showing a queen handing her knight a token. Maybe a ribbon, maybe a glance that said far more than 1,000 royal decrees. Love in a palace is like fire in a library. Dangerous, ill-advised, and yet so very inevitable. You've probably been taught that queens were either dutiful wives or wicked temptresses, Madonnas or Jezebels. But history, as it turns out, is written mostly by those who are neither in the bedroom nor the throne room. The truth is far more layered. Imagine a world where marriage is strategy, not affection, where being a woman in power is already a threat, where your every move is scrutinized, whispered about, or written in court records by men who feared or envied you. Now imagine falling in love anyway, or at least deciding to have some fun. Royal courts were filled with spies, scribes, and scandal-hungry nobles. That's what makes the stories you're about to hear so impressive. These weren't accidental romances, these were calculated risks. These women played chess with their bodies and their crowns, and in many cases, the world never found out. Or found out too late to stop them, because when you're the queen, sometimes all it takes is a nod, a glance, and a well-placed chambermaid to look the other way. Tonight, we'll slink behind the silk veils of Cleopatra's boudoir, where the perfume is strong enough to cloud judgment and loyalty. We'll sneak through the hallowed halls of Versailles, where Marie Antoinette might have snuck her lover past armed guards, wrapped in a cloak. We'll gallop across frozen Swedish lakes with Queen Christina, dressed as a man, possibly in the company of a woman she loved. We'll hear echoes of laughter from Ottoman harems and catch a glimpse of ink-stained love letters hidden under mattresses. Each queen has her method, her mystery, her lover, or lovers. And don't expect this to be a morality play. This isn't about judging anyone. It's about understanding how power, desire, and danger swirl together like brandy in a royal goblet. Take Catherine the Great, for instance. The rumours say everything from horse-related nonsense to wild orgies. The truth? A fiercely intelligent woman who handpicked her lovers like a CEO assembling a board of directors. Practical, sometimes ruthless, but never boring. One historical fact to chew on as we settle in. In many royal courts, queens were expected to be politically loyal, but emotional fidelity wasn't always demanded, at least not by those who truly understood how court games were played. Affairs could be tolerated if they didn't produce scandal, or worse, illegitimate heirs who could shake the lineage tree just enough to drop a few heads. But even then, some queens danced that tightrope. Some even flaunted it. Here's a fringe tidbit. Did you know that some royal lovers, especially male favourites, were given actual titles, land and pensions simply for being pleasing companions? Yep, one day you're a low-born noble with a nice face, the next you're Duke of Flirtshire and sipping wine in bed with the most powerful woman in Europe. Not a bad gig, honestly. Now, about scholarly debate. There's always a tug-of-war between historians who want hard proof and those who read between the lines. Letters can be forged, diaries can be exaggerated, but behaviour, that's harder to fake. When a queen starts spending every waking hour with a handsome courtier, makes him general of the army despite his terrible military record, and legitimately he's got a palace next to hers, let's just say the historians start sharpening their quills. But don't worry. You're not here for a textbook. You're here to feel the chill of a midnight rendezvous through stone corridors, to hear the silk rustle as a queen turns toward the wrong man and doesn't care, to smell the wax and perfume and scandal, to watch power and passion collide in ways that were dangerous, brilliant, and sometimes genuinely romantic. So settle in, because from here on out, every queen you meet will teach you something new about what it means to love dangerously and rule anyway. You're standing at the edge of the Nile, the sky stretched out in bruised gold and violet, the kind of twilight that makes everything feel like it's about to change. You turn, and there she is, Cleopatra VII, draped in linen so fine it might as well be smoke, eyes lined in kohl that dares you to look away. You don't. No one ever does. She isn't just a queen, she is Egypt, and soon she'll have Rome wrapped around her finger. First Caesar, then Antony. But this is where it all starts. Let's be honest, Cleopatra wasn't just playing the game, she was inventing new rules, new pieces, new ways to win. She's 21 when she meets Julius Caesar. Rome thinks she's a puppet, Egypt thinks she's too bold, but Cleopatra thinks, well, she thinks it's time to survive. And survival in her case means seduction. Not just in the boudoir, though certainly that was part of it. No, her seduction was political, intellectual, theatrical. She understood image, drama, power, mythology. She literally sailed down the Nile, pretending to be the goddess Isis. Because when you're trying to win over the most powerful man in the world, why not show up as a living deity? You sneak through the palace corridors, trailing behind her as she arranges to be smuggled into Caesar's chambers rolled up in a rug. Is it cliché? Yes. Is it brilliant? Also, yes. That one moment, risky, theatrical, and undeniably flirtatious, becomes the opening move in a liaison that shifts the entire balance of power in the ancient Mediterranean. Caesar falls for her, or at least falls for the image of her. Intelligent, ambitious, exotic, politically savvy. She gets him to restore her throne, eliminate her rivals, and grant her legitimacy that Egypt alone couldn't. Historical fact: Cleopatra didn't just charm Caesar with her looks, she was multilingual, educated, and deeply skilled in statecraft. She spoke at least 7 languages and was the first of her dynasty to actually speak Egyptian. When she debated philosophy with Caesar's scholars, they weren't sure if they were in love with her or just wildly intimidated. Possibly both. Of course, Caesar doesn't last. Assassinated on the Senate floor, stabbed by men who feared he was becoming a king, which, to be fair, was kind of the vibe. Cleopatra flees back to Alexandria, her heart intact, power consolidated. She'd had a child with him, Caesarion, and that gave her leverage, but it also made her dangerous. Rome didn't like foreign queens with Roman bloodlines, bad for morale, worse for politics. Fast forward a few years, you're at sea, the salt wind tugging at your cloak, and across the deck you spot him, Mark Antony. If Caesar was cold calculation, Antony is pure heat, brash, impulsive, and wildly charming. A soldier's general, but not exactly a politician's dream. Cleopatra meets him on a royal barge so decadent it makes Versailles look like a cheap motel. The sails are purple, the oars silver, musicians playing as flower petals rain from above. Cleopatra appears again as Isis. Antony, to no one's surprise, loses his entire mind. Their love affair becomes legendary. Half political alliance, half lust-fueled fever dream. They drink, hunt, Sibia, debate. She funds his military campaigns. He gives her more territory. They play at being gods, literally forming a cult of Dionysus and Isis. And for a while it works. Egypt is rich again. Rome is nervous. Octavian, Caesar's heir, starts spreading rumours that Antony is bewitched, enslaved, no longer Roman. Fringe fact incoming. There are claims Antony and Cleopatra founded a club called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated entirely to eating, drinking, and pushing sensual boundaries. Think dinner parties with peacock tongues and wine-soaked carpets. Probably not the healthiest governance model, but undeniably stylish. But here's the thing, was it love or just strategy wrapped in passion? Scholars still argue about it. Some say Cleopatra saw Antony as a tool, just as she did Caesar, a way to protect Egypt's sovereignty. Others believe the affection was real, if ill-fated. They spent nearly a decade together, had 3 children, and seemed, by every account, to be entwined in ways neither fully controlled. But could Cleopatra ever really love? Or did she just understand that survival, for a woman in her position, meant making men fall for her? You're with her in her final days, the walls closing in as Octavian's forces breach Alexandria. She locks herself in a mausoleum with her handmaidens, sends a message to Antony claiming she's already dead. Whether by accident or design, Antony stabs himself in despair. The tragedy feels Shakespearean, but the real moment is quieter. Cleopatra, dressed in her finest robes, her hair and makeup done to perfection, takes her own life, or so the story goes, with a venomous asp pressed to her skin. There's debate about that too. Snakebite, poison, a dagger? No one knows. Octavian, now Augustus, arrives too late. Cleopatra is already a legend. But what matters isn't how she died. It's that for nearly 2 decades, Cleopatra defied the expectations of her gender, her culture, and 2 of the greatest empires in history. She took lovers, bore royal children, and refused to be a pawn, and somehow, even when the Roman historians tried to smear her as a harlot queen, she still comes through as powerful, intelligent, and unforgettable. You step back from the stone sarcophagus, the scent of lotus and blood lingering in the air. You've just witnessed a love that was dangerous, opulent, possibly doomed from the start, but it changed the world, and Cleopatra, she got away with it for a while. That's more than most could say. You're galloping across the green hills of medieval Aquitaine, and the air smells like lavender, sweat, and a hint of defiance. You grip the reins tighter, your eyes scanning the horizon. Somewhere behind you, a tournament blares its trumpets, knights crashing into each other with the drama of overpaid actors. But you're not watching the joust, you're watching her. Eleanor, 17 years old, already the Duchess of Aquitaine, the richest heiress in Europe, and not even pretending to care what anyone thinks. She's too busy writing the first chapter of a life that's going to outshine most legends. Eleanor of Aquitaine doesn't just take lovers, she collects power. And for a girl born in the 12th century, that's like walking barefoot across a minefield with a smirk. Her first husband is Louis VII of France. She's barely out of childhood when she's married off to him, dragged into a court full of bishops and piety, and told to behave like a saint. Eleanor doesn't do saints. She does poetry, courtly love, and men who understand the value of flirtation as diplomacy. Historical fact, Eleanor was a major patron of troubadours, those wandering lyricists who sang about longing, beauty, and scandal. She practically invented the idea of courtly love as a cultural movement. Her court at Poitiers becomes the hotspot for everything romantic and provocative. You can almost hear the lute music in the background and the awkward love poems being whispered behind curtains. Eleanor isn't just encouraging it. She's the lead vocalist in the soundtrack of medieval romance. Louis, bless him, is entirely outmatched. He's pious, dull, and more interested in monastic reform than his dazzling wife. Their marriage is a mess. Even the church steps in to try to patch things up, but it doesn't help that Eleanor insists on joining him for the Second Crusade. You'd think a queen showing up on a holy war would be considered bold, maybe inspiring. Nope, it causes a political meltdown. She rides at the head of her troops dressed in armour. Rumours swirl. Some say she bathed naked with her ladies in the sea. Others whisper about an affair with her uncle Raymond of Antioch. That's your fringe fact tonight. While no one can confirm a tryst, letters from the time hint at undue familiarity. And when Louis drags her away from Antioch, he reportedly has to physically separate them. Eleanor, for her part, refuses to be silent. She tells him she wants an annulment. She's tired of being married to a monk, and here's where it gets even better. The marriage is annulled on grounds of consanguinity. Basically, we're too related. Which, hilariously, was a common excuse when royalty got bored of each other. Eleanor is now a free woman. Well, sort of. She's also the most eligible, richest and independent woman in Europe. Which means danger. She gets kidnapped. Twice on her journey back to Aquitaine by men trying to force her into marriage. You hide in the crowd as she outwits them both, eventually reaching safety and making her own choice. She marries Henry Plantagenet, who will soon become Henry II of England. And this is not a fairy tale. This is Game of Thrones with better tapestries. The passion between them burns hot, so hot they reportedly can't keep their hands off each other in public. They have 8 children, including 2 future kings, and for a time Eleanor seems content. But Henry, unlike Louis, isn't intimidated. He's controlling, ambitious, and not the kind of man to tolerate a wife with political opinions, or any opinions, really. Which brings us to the lovers. Now, no one's entirely sure who Eleanor took to her bed after Henry's affections shifted to his mistress, Rosamund Clifford. Some suggest Eleanor had affairs during her earlier years, possibly even before her marriage to Henry. Others think her real romance was political, with her sons in open rebellion against their father. But here's the scholarly debate. Was Eleanor involved with a nobleman during her long imprisonment? Yes, imprisonment. After supporting her sons in revolt, Henry locks her up for 16 years. She's kept under house arrest in various castles, her communication restricted, yet even then she manages to pull strings. When Henry dies, Eleanor is released, and suddenly she's Queen Mother, regent, matchmaker to Europe. She arranges marriages, negotiates treaties, and advises her favourite son, Richard the Lionheart, like she never missed a beat. There's a persistent rumour that she was involved with one of Richard's knights. A young man named William Marshall is sometimes mentioned, a dashing, brilliant figure who later becomes legendary in his own right. No proof, no love letters, but plenty of opportunity, and Eleanor, she never needed permission to rewrite her own story. You walk beside her now in her later years, as she crosses the Alps in winter, in her 70s, to secure a bride for her grandson. Still regal, still commanding, still untouchable. Her eyes are sharp, her voice low but firm. She's lost lovers, kings, sons, battles, but never her sense of self. That's the real legacy. Whether she took secret lovers or simply kept the court in a state of romantic tension, Eleanor knew exactly how to wield her presence like a blade. In the end, you sit beside her tomb at Fontevraud Abbey, where she lies carved in stone next to Henry, the man who both desired and imprisoned her. But her hands are holding a book, not his. A final flex. A woman of intellect, autonomy, and just enough mystery to keep the historians arguing for centuries. She got away with it. Every part of it. You're standing in a cold stone chamber in a London tower, the fire crackling low, and you can hear it, the murmured plotting, the sharp shuffle of armour, the unmistakable tension of a queen doing something queens are never supposed to do. Behind the heavy oak door, Isabella of France is adjusting her veil. She doesn't look scared. She looks focused. There's ink on her fingers, wax dripping onto a folded letter, and the faintest scent of sandalwood in the air. Tonight she sends word to her lover, not a courtier or poet, but a commander, a rebel, a man who by every royal rule should have been her executioner. But that's the thing about Isabella. She always chooses the most dangerous path. And she never walks it alone. They call her the she-wolf of France. It's not a compliment. But it is accurate, if what you mean is a woman who refuses to be caged. Born a French princess and married to King Edward II of England, Isabella arrives at court with every intention of playing the part, beautiful, well-mannered, and devastatingly clever. But almost immediately, it's clear she's entered a kingdom already occupied by her husband's favourites, most notably one Piers Gaveston. Edward doesn't even try to hide it. Piers wears royal clothes, sits beside the king at feasts, and acts like he married Edward himself. Isabella is sidelined politically and emotionally. And in medieval England, that's not just humiliating, it's dangerous. A queen without influence is a queen with a target on her back. Historical fact, Edward II's affection for his male favourites wasn't subtle. He appointed them to high positions, showered them with gifts, and openly preferred their company to that of his wife or nobles. It caused riots, rebellions, and eventually assassination. Gaveston is beheaded by angry lords, and Edward predictably spirals. Isabella, though, she waits, she learns. She watches her husband replace Gaveston with another favourite, Hugh Despenser, a man so corrupt and power-hungry. He makes the last guy look like a charming inconvenience. You walk beside Isabella as she's pushed further into the background, her land seized, her allies banished, but behind that elegant expression is a hurricane. She doesn't sulk. She plans. And when Edward sends her to France on a diplomatic mission, he thinks he's finally rid of her. Instead, Isabella finds her way to Roger Mortimer, a nobleman, rebel, and former prisoner who escaped the Tower of London, literally, and fled to France. He's bold, charismatic, and he hates Hugh Despenser almost as much as she does. That's where the speculation begins. Did Isabella and Mortimer become lovers in exile? Most historians say yes. The timing is almost too perfect. Isabella's confidence explodes, her letters become more aggressive, and when she returns to England, it's not quietly. She brings an army, literally, a queen-turned invader, and Mortimer's right beside her, leading troops like a knight in a steamy political fan fiction. Fringe fact, some accounts claim Isabella wore armour during the campaign. While there's no hard proof she fought, her leadership was undeniable. She wasn't just following Mortimer, she was the face of the rebellion. The English people, sick of Edward's misrule and Despencer's cruelty, greeted her as a hero. Edward flees. Despencer is captured, tortured and executed in ways you probably don't want described before bed. Isabella seizes control, and just like that, she becomes regent for her teenage son, Edward III. She's ruling England, sharing power with Mortimer, living openly with him in court, and no one can stop her. Well, for a while. This is where the scholarly debate turns sharp. Was Isabella truly in love with Mortimer, or was he a necessary partner in crime? Some think he was her equal, her partner in rebellion. Others say he controlled her, that she traded one master for another. But you can't deny this. She chose him. She risked everything, her crown, her life, her child's future, to align with him. That wasn't desperation, that was agency. For 3 years they ruled together, not just as regents, but as de facto monarchs. Mortimer grows bolder, more arrogant. He styles himself like a king. Isabella, now in her mid-30s, enjoys the power she was denied for decades. But her son is growing up. Edward III isn't content to be a puppet. At just 17, he pulls off a palace coup. Mortimer is captured and hanged. Isabella is spared because she's his mother, but her political life is over. You find her years later in quiet retirement, in a castle surrounded by books, gardens and tapestries. She lives out her days with dignity, occasionally receiving her grandchildren. No more rebellion, no more war councils, just soft breezes through stone archways and a lifetime of luxury. There's something melancholy about her ending, but also something triumphant. She may have lost her power, her lover, and her grip on the crown, but she never lost her story. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman who dared to take what she wanted and rewrite the script. Yes, the church whispered. The nobles grumbled. But in the end, Isabella took a lover, toppled a king, and lived to tell the tale. You leave her chamber quietly, passing a dusty portrait where her eyes seem to follow you. Intense, calculating, still wild. She-wolf? Maybe. Or maybe just a woman who refused to be caged. You're walking through a battlefield, not one of swords and shields, but of whispers, papers and thrones and Medina shifting beneath trembling feet. The ground is soft with mud and tension. Horses snort nearby, restless in the fog. And in the middle of it all is Queen Margaret of Anjou, hair swept back beneath a jewelled circlet, eyes locked on the horizon like she already knows it's going to get worse before it gets better. Her husband, Henry VI, is technically king, but he's more ghost than monarch. And Margaret, she's not just filling the power vacuum, she's owning it, completely, and possibly not alone. You follow her into court where the ceiling soars and the air is thick with nervous courtiers. King Henry sits beside her, pale, vague, and muttering prayers. He's barely functional. He suffers from catatonic episodes that leave him unresponsive for months at a time. In those long silences, Margaret becomes more than queen consort. She becomes ruler, strategist, and, if the rumours are to be believed, mistress to the most convenient man in the room. His name is Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Tall, noble, and very available. He's often at Margaret's side, speaking for her when she defers, advising her in private, and taking on a leadership role that looks, frankly, more romantic than it should. The court doesn't miss it, and neither do you. Historical fact. Margaret's relationship with Somerset raised enough eyebrows that when she gave birth to her son, Edward of Westminster, the gossip hit like wildfire. Whispers swept through the realm. Is the child even the king's? Henry hadn't been coherent in months when Margaret conceived. A fact that would be awkward in any marriage, but in the context of royal succession, that's downright nuclear. The fringe detail. Margaret reportedly fought anyone, noble, bishop, or rebel, who dared question her son's legitimacy. She'd appear in full armour beside her boy, raise her sword, and swear he was the true heir. Motherhood, in her case, wasn't gentle. It was warlike, fierce, loud, though if there was an affair, she buried it beneath blood and loyalty. And yet the scholarly debate around Edward's paternity is still alive, centuries later. Some historians argue there's no way the child could have been Henry's, pointing to the king's mental collapse and the suspicious timing. Others believe the gossip was a political weapon, spread by the Yorkist faction, to undermine the Lancastrian claim to the throne. After all, nothing discredits a queen faster than accusing her of adultery, especially with a conveniently hated nobleman. You ride with Margaret now, her cloak billowing behind her, her son tucked safely in the wagon. It's the Wars of the Roses, And she's not just along for the ride, she's driving the cart through hell. Henry is basically a living banner, rolled out when convenient. Margaret leads the armies. She negotiates with foreign powers. She raises funds, recruits soldiers, commands respect. She does everything a king should do, and still gets none of the credit. But if you look closely, it's not just her public strength that keeps her going. There's something else, something private. Somerset dies early in the war, leaving Margaret isolated. You notice how, even after his death, she visits the places they once met in secret. You catch her fingers tracing the edges of an old letter when she thinks no one's looking. Was it love? Was it necessity? Was it both? There's a part of you that wants to believe she found solace in Somerset, that amid the chaos she had someone to hold, to trust. But there's also the colder possibility that it was calculated, a strategic alliance disguised as affection. Margaret had no room for softness. Everything in her life was a transaction, even love. The tragedy unfolds slowly. Her son grows into a warrior, angry and passionate, traits that seem far more Beaufort than Lancaster. He dies at the Battle of Tewkesbury, cut down in the mud before he ever wears a crown. Margaret is captured, imprisoned, then ransomed back to France, where she lives in quiet disgrace, alone and forgotten. You find her at twilight, sitting in a crumbling manor in Anjou, the gardens overgrown, her gown faded to grey. She doesn't speak of the war, or the throne, or the son she lost. But her eyes still burn with the memory of what she almost held on to. For a woman accused of starting one of England's bloodiest conflicts, she dies strangely quietly. No final monologue, no royal retribution, just stillness. Here's the kicker. Despite the accusations, the gossip and the chaos, Margaret never confessed. Not once, not to her enemies, not to her allies. She carried the scandal to the grave untouched and unresolved. And maybe that's the best kind of power. Making the world wonder forever what really happened behind those stone castle walls. You step back from the edge of her story, heart heavy, mind racing. Margaret may not have worn a lover's ring openly. She may never have carved hearts into castle walls or signed letters with X's and longing. But she took what she needed, when she needed it. Power, loyalty, perhaps love, and she got away with it. At least until the world she built crumbled into civil war. But even in ruin, she remains the woman who fought a kingdom for her son, who may have defied a king for a man who made her feel alive, who never said sorry. You're padding softly through a palace where the walls whisper in French and Russian, but the heart of it all beats in crisp, strategic Russian, Catherine's Russian. You turn a corner and there she is, Empress Catherine II of Russia, reclining with the confidence of someone who knows the world bends toward her, even if it tries to resist. There's a crystal decanter half full of sweet Tokaji wine, her lapdog asleep in the crook of her elbow, and beside her stands a young officer, tall, polished, and absolutely not her husband. Which is fine. She left that whole husband thing behind before the first thunderclap of her reign. Tonight, the topic isn't about thrones or treaties. It's about favourites, lovers, the velvet thread that wove through her decades in power and never quite unravelled. They always called them favourites, as if these men were mere baubles, a cute rotation of decorative young things. But for Catherine, her lovers were never just warm bodies. They were tools, yes. Gifts to herself, definitely. But they were also partners in power, protectors of her person, and more often than not, pawns she adored, until she didn't. Historical fact, Catherine the Great ruled Russia for 34 years, and during that time she took at least a dozen known lovers. Some stayed for months. Others lasted years, and every one of them was vetted personally. She didn't just swipe right on noblemen. She interviewed them, observed them, occasionally even let her most trusted confidant, Countess Bruce, test them first. No joke. It was like running an audition for the role of Empress's companion, with a performance review system and a severance package that included land, titles, and enough money to retire in style. You walk with her now through her winter palace, past hallways lined with oil portraits and velvet tapestries. Behind each door is a story. Grigory Orlov, for example, wasn't just a lover. He helped her overthrow her husband, Peter III. Yes, the same Peter who mysteriously died shortly after being deposed. No one asked too many questions, and Catherine, she married the Empire instead. Orlov was rewarded handsomely, until his usefulness faded and his instability grew. Then came Grigory Potemkin. the man who may or may not have been her secret husband. Ah yes, here's the scholarly debate. Did Catherine secretly marry Potemkin? Some historians think so. They exchanged rings, spent years as confidants and lovers, and though their romantic relationship cooled, their political partnership only deepened. He built her cities, commanded her armies, flirted with her rivals. They wrote letters, hundreds of them, calling each other my soul, my everything, and the occasional spicy nickname too scandalous for this bedtime format. Your fringe fact tonight? Catherine had a literal love apartment built inside the palace. A set of rooms, lavishly decorated, where her current favourite could live discreetly close to her. It was like having an on-call boyfriend suite with room service and an imperial seal. Not everyone knew who the current occupant was, but the court always guessed. They kept score like it was a sport. Still, Catherine wasn't delusional about any of it. She knew these men loved her power more than her, she just didn't care. Love for her wasn't about naivety, it was about exchange. You give her affection, loyalty, and your best performance, and she gives you a slice of the empire's opulence. It's transactional, it's theatrical, it's efficient, and sometimes, just sometimes, it's real. One evening, you find her sitting alone at her writing desk, quill in hand, eyes heavy. There's a letter she won't send. Maybe it's for Potemkin, maybe for one of the younger favourites who aged out of the rotation but never really left her heart. Her empire stretches across continents, her armies are undefeated, but in the quiet moment, she's just a woman who dared to want everything and took it. Of course, her enemies spun these affairs into scandal. Foreign ambassadors wrote gleeful dispatches calling her insatiable, immoral, unfit. The British press painted her as a seductress with no shame, forgetting they had kings doing worse. And then came that rumour. You know the one, the horse. Let's just squash it here. No, she did not. It was a fabrication, probably French propaganda, designed to humiliate a woman who dared to rule like a man and love like she didn't care who watched. And still, she got away with it. No abdication, no exile, no dagger in the night. She died peacefully in her bed in 1796, ruler of the largest empire on earth, her legacy packed with reforms, art, education, and a lot of ex-boyfriends with suspiciously nice estates. You leave the Winter Palace with the sound of her heels still echoing behind you. Catherine was no fool. She knew that in a world ruled by men, being a woman in power meant controlling your image and your lovers. She didn't apologise, she organised. She curated her affairs with the same precision she used to expand her borders. She wasn't the great because she was perfect. She was great because she was bold, and because somehow, with a court full of spies and a church full of judgment, she took lover after lover and reigned undisturbed. You're in Stockholm now, but not the prim, IKEA-polished version. This is 17th century Sweden, snow crackling under your boots, pine trees shivering under the weight of ice, and the streets humming with the kind of tension that always follows a monarch who refuses to act royal. Queen Christina doesn't walk into rooms, she blows the doors off. She's in men's clothes more often than court-approved gowns, quoting Plato while fencing with generals, and openly scoffing at the idea of marriage. Tonight she's holding a salon in her private study. Candles flicker across stacks of pink texts, a violin sighs in the corner, and the room is thick with something unspoken, curiosity, rebellion, and maybe the beginning of a love story. Christina is 18 when she inherits the Swedish throne, but she's been raised like a prince since birth, literally. Her father insisted she be educated like a boy. Swordplay, philosophy, history, diplomacy, no embroidery lessons, no courtly giggles. She speaks 5 languages, collects rare books and art, and occasionally forgets or refuses to act remotely feminine. Her wardrobe includes silk breeches, doublets, and occasionally full armour. You trail her through the palace, watching noblemen whisper behind gloved hands. But she doesn't care. Christina is busy shaping her kingdom, and herself into something entirely original. Historical fact: Queen Christina of Sweden refused to marry, despite immense pressure from every direction, including the Pope, the Swedish Parliament, and every eligible bachelor with a title and a pulse. She repeatedly said no. "I have no intention of giving up my freedom for the sake of a man," she once declared. Bold words in a century where queens were usually seen as wombs with a crown. Now enter the handmaiden. Ebba, spare, beautiful, devoted, constantly at Christina's side day and night. They sleep in the same bed. They write passionate letters. Christina calls her Belle and signs her notes with phrases like, "I love you above all things." You step into one of those letters, ink still wet with feeling, and it's not subtle, it's intimate, flirtatious, and occasionally downright possessive. Whether they were lovers in the physical sense, that's the scholarly debate. But emotionally, it's clear. This is not just friendship, not just court routine, this is something deeper. Your fringe fact for tonight: Christina once introduced Ebba to a visiting ambassador as her bedfellow. Which, okay, maybe that sounds innocent now, but in the 1600s, it raised eyebrows higher than the powdered wigs they'd eventually wear in Versailles. And when Ebba eventually married another man, a nobleman Christina herself arranged for, Christina went into a spiral of melancholy that lasted for months. Heartbreak, jealousy, or just the loneliness of being too different. Maybe all of it. Still, Christina kept pushing boundaries. She refused to be crowned in the traditional ceremony. She started dabbling in Catholicism, which was a hard no in deeply Protestant Sweden. She invited foreign scholars and artists to court and let her hair down in more ways than one. Her court looked more like a university than a throne room. There were plays, debates, and plenty of wine. And, as always, Ebba sat nearby, sometimes across the room, sometimes in Christina's shadow, always part of her private world. Then came the twist. Christina abdicates. Just drops the crown. No war, no scandal, no forced exile. She calls her court together and says she's done. She wants out. No more cold winters, no more parliament breathing down her neck, no more pretending. She rides off into the European sunset, cuts her hair short, and takes the name Cristoforo while travelling. Some say she starts dressing fully as a man during her travels. Others say she simply couldn't be caged anymore. The moment you realise it's real is when she arrives in Rome. A Swedish Protestant queen walking into the heart of Catholicism to convert. The Vatican is confused. The ambassadors are stunned. But Christina thrives. She surrounds herself with intellectuals, artists, and yes, more whispers, more rumours. She never marries, never takes a known male consort. Instead, she writes long letters to female companions and collects sculptures that would raise the blood pressure of any cardinal. One of them, let's just say, is not a family-friendly depiction of Neptune. And here's where the historical lines blur into shadow. Some say Christina had affairs with women throughout her life. Others argue that her personality was simply eccentric, untethered to typical ideas of gender and sexuality. But the thing no one can deny, she got away with it. All of it. She left the throne on her own terms, converted to a religion she wasn't born into, and built a new life where she answered to no one but herself. You find her again in her Roman villa, older now but no less formidable. The fire flickers against her face as she scribbles letters, edits a play, and occasionally glares at her staff for interrupting her train of thought. Her rooms are cluttered with paintings, half-read books, and hints of rebellion. In the corner, a small framed portrait of Ebba Spara sits among the clutter. Faded, but still there, she dies at 72, buried in the Vatican, a queen who renounced her throne, defied her religion, loved whom she loved, and never apologised. In the centuries since, she's been called everything from insane to divine, but to walk beside her is to know one thing. Christina didn't bend. Not for kings, not for popes, not for husbands she never wanted, and certainly not for rules that weren't written for women like her. You're standing in the echoing stone halls of a Spanish castle, the light coming in through narrow slits like a knife across cold flagstones. The mood here isn't romantic, at least not in the obvious way. There are no flutes or serenades or secret gardens. There's grief, desperation, and the unshakable presence of a woman whose heart refused to die, even when everyone around her insisted it should. This is Joanna of Castile, better known to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. But tonight, you're going to see her differently. Not as a broken relic of royal dysfunction, but as a woman whose love, whether sacred or scandalous, may have been too intense for the world around her to tolerate. It starts out normally enough. Joanna is the daughter of the legendary monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, the power couple who united Spain, funded Columbus, and left very little space for nuance in their rulebook. Joanna's life is mapped out before she even learns to read, a marriage across the sea to cement alliances, a future carved in crown-shaped stone. She's smart, speaks multiple languages, and has the kind of curiosity that makes priests nervous. But at 16, she's married off to Philip the Handsome, Yes, that was his actual title. And everything changes. Philip is charming. The kind of charming that doesn't just flirt, it conquers. Blonde, tall, courtly, the exact opposite of Spain's sombre rigidity. Joanna falls for him hard, not political love, not royal duty, actual gut-level, heart-thumping, stay-up-all-night waiting for him love. And for a while it's returned. They have children, they dance. He calls her his beloved. But Philip has other appetites, mainly women who are not his wife. And this is where Joanna's reputation starts to split. Historical fact, Joanna was known to have intense emotional outbursts when she suspected infidelity. She would scream, cry, confront mistresses, and in one case reportedly cut off the hair of a lady-in-waiting she thought got too close to Philip. She wasn't subtle, and she wasn't quiet. She reacted the way women in love aren't supposed to, at least not queens, who are expected to suffer insolence and smile at banquets. As Philip's affairs piled up, Joanna's mental state began to fracture, or so the reports say. But here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was Joanna truly mad? Or was she simply inconvenient? A deeply emotional woman in a time and position where female autonomy was a threat? Her behaviour, when viewed without the misogynistic filter of 16th century court politics, reads a lot more like heartbreak than madness. She wasn't violent, she wasn't delusional in the clinical sense. She was in pain, and no one around her was willing to let that be the truth. And then Philip dies. He's 28. Sudden illness, maybe typhoid, maybe poison. No one really knows. But Joanna? She breaks, not quietly, not privately. She refuses to bury him. She keeps the coffin with her, travels with it. Sleeps beside it, opens it to check that he's still there. The court says this is madness. You're standing in a candlelit chapel now, watching her kneel beside the coffin, whispering prayers. Is it unhinged? Maybe, but it's also devastatingly human. Fringe fact. For several months after Philip's death, Joanna travelled at night, insisting that no other woman could lay eyes on his body. She would halt entire caravans if she believed women were nearby. To her, he was still hers, always would be. Even in death. It sounds obsessive, but imagine loving someone so intensely in a world that denied you everything else that grief becomes your last act of rebellion. But her family had had enough. Her father, Ferdinand, moves to take control of Castile. He declares her mentally unfit to rule and locks her away in a convent. A literal cloister for the woman once meant to rule half of Europe. Her son Charles, yes, the future Holy Roman Emperor, keeps her there. She will remain confined for the rest of her life. 46 years. This is where you find her now, grey-haired, barefoot in the cold chapel floors of Tordesillas. She's not violent. She's not drooling or raving or hallucinating like the legends claim. She prays, she sings softly to herself. Occasionally she screams into the silence, but who wouldn't? The world labelled her mad so it could keep the crown safe in male hands. Her love was messy, loud but real. And here's the mystery. Was she truly ill? Or was she a casualty of politics? Modern psychologists examining her records lean toward bipolar disorder or prolonged trauma response. But the historical accounts are all second-hand, written by men with reasons to silence her. One thing we do know, the people who stood to benefit from her madness diagnosis were the same people who profited from her removal. The tragedy of Joanna's story isn't just the madness, it's the way her love was weaponized against her. Her grief was turned into diagnosis, her devotion became derangement, and all of it happened in locked rooms, away from the public eye. You leave her in the chapel, the candlelight flickering against the stone walls, her figure kneeling by the memory of a man who may not have deserved her, but who she refused to forget. Her story isn't tidy. It doesn't end with a crown or a grand rebellion, but she held on to something no one could take. Not even with 46 years of sadden, she held on to love, in all its mess, madness and memory. And in a world that punished queens for being anything more than symbols, that alone was a revolution. You're on the deck of a ship now, somewhere in the Mediterranean, the wind tugging at the sails and the scent of sea salt and orange blossoms curling into your nose. A woman in an embroidered cloak leans against the railing, her gaze fixed on the pink-gold horizon. Her hair is barely tamed under a wide-brimmed hat, and beside her, lounging in entirely inappropriate proximity for a court musician, is a dark-eyed Italian man tuning his lute. This is Queen Caroline of Brunswick, wife, technically, of George IV of England. And this is where royal marriage stops being a fairy tale and starts being one long, awkward soap opera with a surprisingly catchy soundtrack. Let's get this out of the way. Caroline's marriage was a disaster before the ink dried on the contract. She and George were both nobility, sure, but compatibility? Chemistry, not even close. He was arrogant, self-absorbed, and already in love with someone else. She was sharp-tongued, eccentric, and not particularly inclined to play the submissive royal wife. When they met for the first time, George reportedly asked for brandy. She called him fat. They managed to produce one child, Princess Charlotte, through what must have been the most awkward royal bedroom encounter in history, and then immediately began avoiding each other like plague patients in a shared flat. You're strolling through the gilded halls of Carlton House, watching them pass like ships in the night. George begins openly cavorting with his mistress, Maria Fitzherbert, while Caroline is left to play the part of rejected consort. But instead of wallowing, she does something unthinkable for her time. She takes off, literally. She packs her trunks, grabs her entourage, and sets off across Europe with nothing but her title, her spite, and a suspiciously handsome musician named Bartolomeo Pergami. Historical fact, Caroline met Pergami in 1814 in Milan, where he was working as a courier and low-level attendant. Within weeks he was promoted to chamberlain. Then came the titles, the land, the matching dinner parties, the increasingly eyebrow-raising seating arrangements. The British press exploded with rumours, and Caroline, she made zero effort to quiet them. You're with her now in Italy, where she lives in a sprawling villa outside of Naples. She and Pergami host theatrical dinners, ride together, bathe in the same sea, and are frequently spotted sharing rooms. Caroline insists he's just her loyal servant. But when you see him feeding her grapes at a garden party while wearing a sash she personally pinned on him, the whole loyal servant bit starts to wobble. Here's your fringe fact. Caroline and Pergami once toured the Holy Land together. During the trip they visited mosques, danced in the streets of Cairo, and rode donkeys through Jerusalem. Caroline reportedly dressed in local fashion and insisted Pergami be addressed as Sir Bartolomeo. This wasn't a quiet retreat. It was a very loud middle finger to every expectation placed on her as a royal woman, especially a royal woman under suspicion. By now the British government is panicking. George is furious, not because he loves Caroline, but because her antics are making him look ridiculous. He tries to divorce her, publicly and messily. Parliament launches the infamous Pains and Penalties Bill in 1820, aiming to strip Caroline of her title and accuse her of adultery with Pergami. The trial is salacious. Witnesses are bribed or intimidated. Testimonies include details of Caroline and Pergami dining alone, sharing bedrooms, and, gasp, kissing his hand in public. The scholarly debate, of course, swirls around whether they actually had a sexual relationship. The court couldn't produce irrefutable proof. No smoking gun, just observations, coincidences, and a string of testimonies about locked doors and shared wine glasses. But whether or not they consummated anything, Caroline never played innocent. She refused to deny intimacy. Her whole defence was more of a shrug than a scandalised denial. It was almost like she dared the world to call her out, and then refused to flinch when they did. She returns to England at the height of the trial, arriving in London like a celebrity. The public loves her, partly because they hate George, and partly because she's become the underdog in this royal drama. People chant her name in the streets. Broadsheets publish caricatures of her riding in triumph. And yet, when George is finally crowned king, he bans her from the coronation. Literally locks the doors in her face. You're with her as she tries to enter Westminster Abbey. Her carriage halted by guards, she demands entrance. She is, after all, the queen, but no one moves. A crowd gathers. She's humiliated, heartbroken. She returns to her lodgings, exhausted, humiliated, and within weeks, dead. Poisoned? Maybe, or just worn down by years of legal battles, gossip, and public humiliation. Her funeral procession becomes a riot when the authorities try to reroute her body away from central London. People fight in the streets to see her buried with dignity or... And here's the thing, Caroline got away with it. Not because she was subtle, not because she denied anything, but because she refused to play the game. In a world where royal women were expected to suffer in silence, she laughed too loud, travelled too far, and maybe, just maybe, loved someone wildly inappropriate in full view of Europe. You're left standing on the Italian coast now, waves crashing at your feet, remembering her with a smile. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't even always likeable. but she lived defiantly, fully and on her own terms. And Bartolomeo Pergami? He kept his titles, his estate, and, some say, a locked trunk filled with letters from the queen he might have loved. You're walking through mirrored corridors lit by chandeliers that seem to drip with diamonds, where perfume hangs heavier than the politics. The air inside the French court is always a little too sweet, a little too dangerous. You brush past silks and powdered wigs, past laughter that doesn't reach the eyes, and you're led through a narrow private door past a hidden stairwell. You're in Versailles, yes, but not in the gold-drenched public salons. You're in the shadow spaces now, the places no one speaks about unless they're already whispering. And waiting in the candlelit hush is Marie Antoinette. Not the caricature with the cake, but a lonely, complicated woman who might just be in love with someone who isn't her husband. Let's make something clear. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were an arranged match from the start. Austria married her off at age 14 to France's awkward, indecisive Dauphin to seal an alliance between two empires that hated each other only slightly less than they feared each other. It wasn't love, it wasn't even flirtation, it was strategy. And when you're a teenager dropped into one of the most scrutinised courts in Europe, surrounded by enemies and forced to produce heirs for a man who's more interested in locks and keys than you, well, you start looking for companionship somewhere else. Historical fact, Louis and Marie Antoinette didn't consummate their marriage for 7 years. 7 years. The pressure was so intense that even Empress Maria Theresa, Marie's mother, wrote letters practically begging the young couple to get it together. Meanwhile, courtiers began to murmur that the queen was barren, frigid, or more interestingly, unfaithful. Enter Axel von Fersen, a Swedish nobleman with just enough charm and cheekbones to make an entire court forget their manners. You catch sight of him now in the queen's private drawing room, standing just a bit too close, speaking in a low voice that somehow makes even French sound like a secret. He's dashing, impeccably dressed, and already half in love with her before he even realises it. She notices him too. He's not like the stiff courtiers who posture for attention. He's calm, intelligent and loyal, dangerously loyal. Their connection grows slowly, quietly. At first, they're just friends. He's often at her side during public appearances. They write letters. He carries messages between her and her family in Austria. But then the letters start to change. The phrasing grows warmer, the ink darker. Soon entire passages are blacked out, censored by someone, though no one knows who. Some of them end with phrases like, "I love you madly." Your fringe fact tonight? Many of these letters were discovered decades later with redacted lines, portions carefully blotted out. Using modern forensic technology, some of the hidden messages have been reconstructed. And yes, they suggest far more than political concern. They speak of longing, of private anguish, of intimacy beyond friendship. Were they lovers? We can't say with certainty, but it wasn't just polite diplomacy. The scholarly debate is as fiery as ever. Some historians insist the affair was purely emotional, two lonely royals in over their heads, clinging to one another as the monarchy crumbled. Others argue that Fersen fathered at least one of Marie Antoinette's children, pointing to physical resemblance and suspicious timing. No definitive proof has ever surfaced, but the gossip fueled the revolutionary press. To the angry mobs outside Versailles, she was already guilty. You walk with her through the gardens now, late at night when the lanterns are out and the wind has picked up. She's pale but not fragile, elegant but not vain. She tells you about the locked staircases that run between her bedroom and secret chambers. She doesn't say who uses them, but you get the sense that someone has. Maybe more than once. The real heartbreak comes not in the romance, but in the fall. As the revolution explodes, Louis and Maria are arrested. Fersen doesn't vanish. In fact, he orchestrates their failed escape attempt. The infamous flight to Varennes. You're in the carriage with them, Marie in disguise, Axel, watching every road, every landmark, knowing full well the risk. If they make it, they live. If not, well, you know how this ends. They're caught, dragged back to Paris in shame. Louis is executed first. Then months later, Marie Antoinette is tried for crimes ranging from treason to incest. The trial is a farce. She's sentenced to death. On the morning of her execution, she rides in an open cart through a jeering crowd, head held high. Fersen isn't there. He's been exiled from France, but when he hears the news, he wears black for the rest of his life. Here's something that might stick with you. Fersen never married. He lived quietly, always loyal to the memory of Marie. He died in 1810, beaten to death by a mob in Sweden, another casualty of a world that didn't know what to do with men who loved too deeply, too politically, or too inconveniently. You leave her story not with fireworks or flair, but with the heavy hush of absence. The love between Marie and Fersen might never be proven, but its ghost lingers, between ink-stained letters, locked doors, and the silence that falls after the guillotine drops. She was a queen torn apart by revolution, yes, but maybe also a woman who, in the eye of that storm, found one real thing and held onto it, even as the world turned against her. You're standing barefoot on cool stone in a wooden palace nestled beneath a tropical sky, the scent of plumeria and damp earth in the air, the ocean humming somewhere just beyond the trees. This isn't Versailles or Vienna or the gilded echo chambers of Europe. This is Hawaii, lush, volcanic, sovereign. And tonight, in the candlelit hush of a music hall made of native koa wood and crown-moulded ambition, you're listening to the soft notes of a piano. The woman at the keys is Queen Lili'uokalani, composer, poet, ruler, and sitting nearby, watching her like he's hearing the sea for the first time, is her court musician, Charles E. Wilson. But people just called him Charles. And some people, they said he wasn't just listening to her music. Let's get the history set. Lili'uokalani was born into Hawaiian royalty at a time when the islands were an independent kingdom caught between Western empires that wanted a piece of paradise. Educated, musically gifted, and fluent in both Hawaiian and English, she was everything the colonizers didn't expect, intelligent, articulate, and firmly rooted in her cultural identity. When her brother King Kalakaua died, she became queen, and it didn't take long for things to unravel. Historical fact, in 1893, American sugar barons, backed by US Marines, overthrew Lili'uokalani in a coup d'etat. They didn't like her proposed new constitution, which would have restored voting rights to native Hawaiians and taken power back from foreign business owners. Basically, she tried to give her people their country back, and in return she lost her throne. But before all that, before the betrayal, the imprisonment, the annexation, there was Charles. He wasn't royalty, he wasn't even high nobility, a thing. He was a musician, a composer, a man who worked closely with the Queen on her music, especially after her coronation in 1891. You find them late one evening in her private quarters at Iolani Palace, hunched over sheet music, the candlelight flickering against the silver in her hair and the ink smudged on his fingers. They're close, closer than propriety would allow, but here in the quiet, propriety has packed its bags and gone home. They write music together, hymns, marches, lullabies. Lili'uokalani is prolific, over 150 compositions, and Charles is often by her side when those songs are born. One of them, Aloha Ui, becomes her most famous. It's soft, nostalgic, and unmistakably romantic. Scholars often say it was inspired by a goodbye she witnessed between two lovers. Others argue it was personal, too personal, and while Charles's name isn't on the sheet music, you wonder if maybe his presence lingered just off the margins. Here's your fringe fact. Lili'uokalani kept a journal throughout her life. In it, there are several entries that reference Charles, not just as a musician, but as a friend, a comfort, a presence that stayed even as others fled the crumbling palace. There's no open confession, no steamy passage, but the warmth is there. The intimacy is undeniable. Of course, scholarly debate loves a vacuum. Was Charles simply a devoted servant? Was their bond purely musical? Or was it a romance conducted in code, in chord progressions and soft glances behind closed doors? We don't know. The historical record goes fuzzy here, deliberately perhaps. After all, a dethroned queen doesn't need scandal to go with her sorrow. But the tension between them, it plays like a minor key under every page of her story. You're with her now in 1895, after the failed counter-rebellion to restore the monarchy. She's arrested and imprisoned in her own palace. The new regime confiscates her papers, forbids her from leaving, and strips her of all political power. But she still has her piano, still has her music. Charles, by now, has faded from public view, maybe to avoid persecution, maybe because his presence was too dangerous. But in her imprisonment she writes song after song, and you feel it in every measure, longing, dignity, heartbreak, something or someone lost. And then, the final blow, in 1898, Hawaii is annexed by the United States. The monarchy is officially abolished. Lili'uokalani never regains her throne. She spends her remaining years as a private citizen, still respected, still active in philanthropy, but always with the quiet grief of a woman who saw her nation stolen out from under her. She dies in 17. Thousands come to her funeral, flowers blanket the streets. Her music is played softly on ukuleles and stringed instruments. And Charles? His name appears only briefly in a footnote, in a line of musicians who once played in her court. No scandal, no confirmation, just a whisper. But you're standing in her music room now, the light streaming through stained glass, and you swear you can hear them, her fingers on the keys, his low voice suggesting a harmony, something gentle and warm passing between them, a partnership that was maybe more than composition, maybe love, maybe survival, maybe both, because that's the thing about queens, they know how to keep secrets, especially the ones too delicate for history books, and they know how to put their truth into something quieter, something safer, like a melody or a goodbye. You hum aloha. As you step into the sunlight, and for a moment you think about the kind of love that doesn't need to be shouted to be remembered, the kind that lingers in notes, in glances, in pauses between verses, the kind you get away with, just barely. You're surrounded by fog, rolling low over the moors like it's trying to smother a secret. The trees are bare and the wind cuts sharper than any blade. Welcome to 16th century Scotland, a place where thrones are temporary, loyalty is a coin flipped daily, and queens either marry well or die loudly. You're following the sound of hoofbeats through the mud, and there she is, Mary, Queen of Scots, cloaked in black velvet, her red hair trailing behind her like fire in a world determined to snuff her out. She's young, already widowed, already returned from the glamorous chaos of the French court, and now she's about to make the first of several very questionable romantic decisions. Mary Stuart is complicated in all the best ways. Queen of Scotland from 6 days old, Queen Consort of France by 16 and widowed by 18. You might think she'd step carefully after that. She doesn't. She returns to Scotland to rule in person, stepping into a kingdom colder in temperament than its weather. Her first marriage didn't break her, but her next two? That's where things get interesting and steamy and frankly suspicious. Historical fact. Her second husband, Henry Stuart, better known as Lord Darnley, was tall, charming, and descended from royal blood himself. On paper, a perfect match, in reality, a disaster. He was vain, drunken, and manipulative. Worse, he demanded the crown matrimonial which would have made him co-ruler. Mary said no. Darnley didn't like no. You follow their marriage as it descends into paranoia and betrayal. He grows erratic. She grows distant. And then enters James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Bothwell was no courtly suitor. He was rough, brutal, magnetic in the way dangerous men often are. Mary's circle didn't trust him. Some of them feared him, but Mary, she trusted him enough to turn to him when things with Darnley hit a boiling point. And right around then, Darnley's house explodes. Yes, literally explodes. His body is found in the garden, strangled but otherwise unscathed by fire. Your fringe fact. At the time of Darnley's death, Mary had moved him to a house called Kirkerfield. One night, just after she left the property, the building blew up. Darnley was found outside wearing only a nightshirt with no burns. It's almost like someone blew the house up as a distraction, and then made it personal. Almost. So who's the prime suspect? Bothwell, of course. And here's where the scholarly debate sets in like a slow, smoky fire. Was Mary involved in the murder? Did she know about it? Or was she manipulated, trapped by a man with more ambition than mercy? Historians still argue. Some say she orchestrated the whole thing. Others think she was a pawn in Bothwell's game. What's undeniable is what happens next. Within weeks of Darnley's murder, Bothwell is acquitted suspiciously fast, and then he abducts Mary on the road to Edinburgh. She either consents to or is coerced into marriage, depending on whose version you believe. She's 3 months a widow. The people are outraged. The nobles revolt. Her reputation crumbles like a dry bannock. But here's the thing, you can't look away from her. Mary stands in defiance of everyone who demands her submission. She claims love. She claims autonomy. Even as her kingdom spirals into civil war. She has a son, James, by Darnley. Yes, that James, who will later unite the thrones of England and Scotland. But at the moment, that matters less than survival. You walk with her as she's imprisoned by her own lords at Loch Leven Castle. She's forced to abdicate. She escapes, rallies an army, loses, and flees across the border into England, where her cousin Elisabeth welcomes her with chains. What follows is 18 years of house arrest in castles, manors, and fortified estates. A queen without a crown. A woman with too many enemies and not enough friends. But even in captivity, she's still Mary. She writes letters to men across Europe, some flirtatious, some political, some both. She charms her guards, she keeps her wits. There are whispers of secret admirers, of hidden meetings, of coded messages folded into embroidery. One of her jailers is said to have fallen in love with her. Did she return the sentiment, or just use him as a pawn? That's up for debate too. The end comes slow and cruel. After years of surveillance and suspicion, Mary is implicated in the Babington plot, a plan to assassinate Elisabeth and place Mary on the English throne. Whether she knew or merely played the role too well is uncertain. What's clear is that Elisabeth, finally cornered, signs the execution warrant. You're there in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle on a grey February morning. Mary walks to the block in a velvet gown of blood red beneath her mourning cloak, like a final act of theatrical defiance. She forgives her executioner. She prays. She dies with dignity. And as her head falls, the legend rises. Even now, centuries later, historians can't agree on who Mary truly was. Tragic pawn, reckless, romantic, political mastermind, maybe all three. But one thing is certain, she lived and loved on her own terms, even when those terms led her straight into scandal, rebellion, and the blade of an axe. You leave her story as the wind howls across the moors again, carrying with it the sound of horses, rebellion, and maybe, just maybe, a whispered name that never made it into the official records. She took lovers, she took risks, and even in death, Mary, Queen of Scots, got away with more than anyone thought she could. You're back in England now. The year is 1525, and the corridors of court are thick with secrets dressed up as etiquette. Everything smells like rose water, ambition, and a little bit of fear. You can almost hear the rustling of silks, and the not-so-subtle shuffle of positions being jostled just beneath the surface. And there, at the centre of it all, stands Anne Boleyn, clever, composed, and already writing the most dangerous love story in Tudor history. The queen who isn't queen yet. The girl who caught the king's eye and never let it go. Anne doesn't enter quietly. She doesn't have to. She's been raised in the courts of the Netherlands and France, where wit and flirtation are weapons, and she's mastered both. When she returns to England, she's not just fashionable, she's magnetic. She's everything Henry VIII's court isn't prepared for, sharp, unyielding, and maddeningly hard to get. Historical fact, Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon when he began his pursuit of Anne, and unlike so many others before her, Anne doesn't cave. She refuses to be a mistress, refuses to be just another notch in the royal canopy bed. She plays a much longer game, one where she only accepts a crown, not a compromise. That power move delays Henry's obsession for 7 years. 7 years of poems, promises, letters, and very public frustration. He writes her a series of love notes, calling her my mistress and friend and promising body and soul devotion. It would be romantic if it weren't also a geopolitical crisis. You're there as the court watches Anne rise. She replaces Catherine in courtly influence long before she ever wears a crown. Nobles take sides. The church gasps. England begins to fracture under the strain of a king who wants to divorce a Spanish princess and marry the woman who keeps him up at night. It's not just about love, it's about legacies, and Henry is desperate for a male heir. Anne, it seems, is the only woman who can give him both obsession and the future of the Tudor dynasty. But here's where the whispers start, because Anne isn't alone in court. She's surrounded by poets, musicians, courtiers, all of whom seem just a little too enamoured. One in particular stands out, Thomas Wyatt, a poet with a biting pen and wandering eye. He writes verses about an unreachable woman with dark eyes and a sharp tongue. Everyone knows who he's talking about. Your fringe fact tonight? Wyatt may have been Anne's lover before Henry ever took notice. Some scholars argue their relationship never crossed into physical territory, but the poetry tells a different story. In one sonnet, he speaks of noli me tangere, do not touch me, a line written about a deer who belongs to Caesar. The implication is clear. Anne was once his until the king claimed her. Did they ever consummate anything? No one can prove it. But that doesn't stop the rumours from dancing through the court like candlelight on velvet. Even after Anne becomes queen, the court continues to watch her closely. She surrounds herself with young, witty men, musicians like Mark Smeaton, nobles like Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, each one with access to her private chambers, each one a little too present. It's hard to tell where flirtation ends and treason begins. That's the problem with Anne. She enjoys the game too much. She thrives in the tension, and in a court like Henry's, that's like juggling swords while blindfolded. The scholarly debate still burns centuries later. Did Anne take lovers behind the king's back? Or was she a victim of courtly manipulation and Henry's spiralling paranoia? In 1536, just 3 years after finally becoming queen, she's arrested on charges of adultery, incest and treason. 5 men are accused of sleeping with her, including her own brother, George Boleyn. It's a charge so outrageous it seems absurd, but absurdity doesn't save you when the king wants a new wife and a cleaner legacy. You walk with Anne through the Tower of London now, her feet soft on the cold stone, her eyes dry and unblinking. She denies every accusation, and there's no real evidence. Only confessions extracted under torture and gossip turned into official record. Still, the trials move fast. The verdict is inevitable. The scaffold waits. She meets her death with eerie calm. She wears a grey gown, holds her head high, and even forgives the executioner. Her final words are whispered, humble, and strategically gracious. Because even in death, Anne knows how to manage a stage. And here's the twist. After her execution, nearly all of the charges collapse under scrutiny. The timelines don't match, the witnesses contradict themselves. Wyatt is never charged. Historians today largely agree that Anne was framed, her downfall orchestrated by those who hated her influence, or simply wanted her gone so Henry could move on. But in the space between facts and speculation, something lingers. Anne was flirtatious, brilliant, politically daring. Maybe she didn't take lovers. Maybe she just made everyone believe she could, and in a world where a woman's virtue was her leash, that might have been her most subversive act. You leave her tomb at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, tucked inside the tower. There's no grand monument, no statue, just her name, etched in history and whispered with either awe or accusation. She may have died young, betrayed by the very man who moved heaven and Rome to marry her, but Anne Boleyn didn't vanish. She haunted the throne. Her daughter, Elisabeth I, would one day rule England with all the fire and cunning her mother once dared to wield. And Anne, whether she crossed the line or just flirted with it, she took power in a world that punished women for daring to shine too brightly. And for a moment, she got away with it. You're now walking through the hushed, labyrinthine halls of the Forbidden City. The sun is low, casting long shadows across golden roofs and red lacquered doors, and the silence here feels ancient, ceremonial, calculated. But tonight, the ceremony's been stripped away. You're deeper inside the imperial court than you're supposed to be. Past the eunuch-guarded thresholds, beyond the paper screens and carved dragon motifs, you reach a private chamber filled with soft candlelight and sharp-eyed silence. Seated beneath a silk canopy is the woman who truly rules China, Empress Dowager Cixi. And beside her, seated slightly too close for comfort, is a eunuch named Lili'uokalani. Except, if the rumours are to be believed, he wasn't always treated like a eunuch. Let's rewind. Cixi was a low-ranking concubine when she first entered the court, one among hundreds, beautiful, educated, but not particularly special in the eyes of the emperor, until she bore him a son. That changed everything. Her son became the heir. And when the emperor died, Cixi didn't fade politely into the background as tradition required. No, she installed herself behind the throne, literally, by sitting behind a silk screen during court meetings, issuing commands from the shadows, manipulating regents, ministers, and eventually the emperor himself. Historical fact, Cixi ruled China, openly or behind the scenes, for nearly 50 years. She was the power behind 2 emperors and orchestrated coups, suppressed rebellions, restructured the Qing dynasty's finances, and engaged in diplomatic gymnastics with a world that was rapidly encroaching on China's sovereignty. She was formidable, brilliant, and terrifying. And yet, for all her power, the most constant figure by her side was a man who, by definition, shouldn't have been a threat to anyone's virtue, a eunuch, Lili'uokalani, slick-haired, subtle, and fiercely loyal. He served as her personal attendant, and over time, he rose to become one of the most powerful men in court, despite technically being a man in name only. But here's your fringe fact: not all eunuchs were created equal. Some historians believe that the castration process varied wildly in effectiveness and intent. While some eunuchs were truly unable to engage in sexual activity, others, especially those serving in elite roles, were only partially castrated or had procedures that were more symbolic than functional. In Lee's case, there are reports, hushed of course, that he retained some of his anatomy. Enough anyway to spark decades of speculation. Now step into the private quarters again. You watch as Cixi leans in slightly while Lee pours her tea. Their exchange is subtle, wordless. Her fingers brush his sleeve as he bows, and she doesn't flinch. In a court where touch is currency, that's worth noting. He whispers in her ear before she makes key decisions. He screens all her communication. He selects who gains entry into her presence. He knows her moods before she speaks. And when she retires for the night, he stays just outside the curtain, waiting. The scholarly debate simmers just under the surface. Was their relationship truly platonic? Or was it something else, carefully hidden in the folds of silken politics? Official records, of course, say nothing. They paint Lee as a loyal servant. But then why did Cixi elevate him to the highest rank a eunuch could achieve? Why did she allow him to amass unimaginable wealth, property and influence? Why did she protect him from rivals who repeatedly accused him of overstepping? And more importantly, why was she buried with objects that hint at private rituals? Combs, silk robes, even poems connected to Lee's time in her service. You walk beside her now in her final years. The twilight of the Qing dynasty pressing in from all sides. Western powers are carving up China, internal dissent is growing, and her reputation in foreign press is increasingly that of a dragon lady, tyrannical, corrupt, and extravagantly cruel. But the reality is more complex. She's trying to modernize a country without letting it shatter. She builds naval arsenals, allows for limited reforms, and even experiments with new education systems. But she also crushes dissent, imprisons critics, and lets her own paranoia cloud better judgment. Through it all, Lee remains. When she's ill, he's the one who manages the flow of information. When she gives orders on her deathbed, he's the one ensuring they're carried out. And when she dies in 1908, likely poisoned or self-medicated into unconsciousness, Li Lianying ensures she's buried with dignity, in a tomb lined with jade, gold and rumour. Here's something to chew on. After her death, Li is quietly removed from power. He dies less than a year later under suspicious circumstances. Officially, it's illness. Unofficially, the new regime might have decided he knew too much. Or maybe they were just uncomfortable with the eunuch who'd gotten too close to the centre of power, and to the woman who held it so fiercely. You leave the Forbidden City through a side gate, the sun now fully set. The silhouettes of dragons curl along the rooftops, watching. The silence here is still thick. Because no one really talks about what happened in those chambers. It would have been too scandalous to admit that the most powerful woman in China might have taken a lover whose manhood had supposedly been removed. Too complicated, too embarrassing. But if anyone could bend the rules until they snapped, it was Cixi. She rewrote the script of what a woman could be in Imperial China, not with tenderness or humility, but with raw, relentless command. And if she decided to keep one forbidden thing for herself in a life where she gave up almost everything else, well, she had the power to get away with it. You're breathing cold northern air now, walking across slick cobblestones in a city where the rain never quite stops, and the sky always feels 1 hour before dusk. This is Denmark in the late 1500s, a kingdom locked between the old world of saints and swordplay and the newer, more dangerous world of court plots, shifting alliances, and veiled flirtations. And tonight, behind the thick curtains of Frederiksborg Castle, sits a woman few people remember, but who left behind just enough smoke to suggest a fire. Queen Christina of Denmark. Not to be confused with her Swedish namesake from earlier, this Christina rules quietly, cautiously, and possibly intimately. She was married off young, like most princesses, to King Francis II of Lorraine. It was a short marriage, 3 years, 1 child, a few diplomatic victories. Then Francis dies suddenly in 1545, leaving her widowed at just 23. You might think she'd return to Denmark or retire into a pious widowhood. But Christina is not the retiring type. Instead, she enters the European marriage market like a duchess with options, and the men, emperors, dukes and princes, begin circling. Historical fact: Christina was offered in marriage to Henry VIII of England after the death of Jane Seymour. Her response? "If I had two heads, I would happily place one at the disposal of the King of England." Oh, that's real, that's sharp, and that's a woman who knows exactly what game she's playing. Eventually she settles not into another throne, but into a strange little dominion of her own making, returning to the Netherlands and ruling the county of Burgundy as a dowager duchess. But here's where the intrigue begins. You follow her into her salon, where politics and poetry mingle with laughter. And it's not the kings and dukes you notice, it's her ladies-in-waiting, and one in particular. Renée de Cossé, young, intelligent, charming in that quiet, sword-behind-the-smile way. She quickly becomes Christina's favourite, present at dinners, walks, private discussions, and eventually, everywhere. The court gossips. As courts do, the older queen and her younger companion inseparable in a way that makes the older ministers deeply uncomfortable. Your fringe fact: in multiple portraits of Christina from this period, she's shown wearing an elaborate pearl-studded brooch that she reportedly received from Renée. It's shaped like a heart entwined with vines. Probably just a gift, right? And yet it appears again and again. When Christina posed for a formal painting to be sent to the Holy Roman Emperor, she insisted on wearing it. The artist tried to remove it, she refused. That little detail lives on in oil and canvas, while letters, journals, and verbal accounts have mysteriously disappeared. This, of course, is where the scholarly debate kicks into full gear. Was this friendship romantic, platonic, strategic, or was it something we don't quite have words for? Some hybrid of comfort and ambition and closeness born of sharing power in a world that barely let women speak? Historians argue endlessly. But when you step into the quiet corners of Christina's Burgundy court, when you read between the surviving scraps of correspondence and the suspiciously vague records, you start to see something far more personal than a political alliance. You're there one evening as the two women sit by a hearth, feet up on a velvet ottoman, wine half drunk in crystal goblets. The conversation shifts from matters of state to poetry, then drifts into memory. Christina recites a line, Latin, softly, and Renée laughs. A quiet, private moment. Not scandalous, but too comfortable to be merely professional. Christina never marries again. Not for lack of offers, she remains a political prize until her final years. But every time a marriage is proposed, she hesitates, deflects, changes the subject. She keeps Renée close even as advisors push for separation. She grants her titles, property, autonomy unusual for a lady-in-waiting. The other women of the court fade into background noise. But not Renée, and when war inevitably reaches Burgundy's door, when the armies press in and diplomacy frays, Christina doesn't turn to foreign allies or royal cousins. She turns inward. She retreats with a small group, including, always, her quiet companion. Your historical fact, footnote. Later court records show Christina referred to Renée in official documents not by title, but by pet name, Mon Étoile. My star. Which sounds romantic. Maybe too romantic for dusty old bureaucrats, who promptly scratched the phrase from later copies of her correspondence. But in one untranslated original, the ink remains, faded but legible. You walk with Christina in her final days, the castle echoing with wind and old footsteps. She's older now, her once fierce gaze dimmed, but still watching. Renée is still there, not as lady-in-waiting, not as friend, just there, sitting beside her at meals, walking with her in the garden, reading aloud when the Queen's eyes tire. When Christina dies in 1590, she leaves behind not just wealth and a stable province, but one of the most neatly scrubbed legacies in European royal history. No scandal, no surviving confession, just soft rumours, a few stubborn paintings, and a love story that never quite made it into the official version. But if you walk slowly through her archives, through the paintings, the jewellery, the gentle turns of phrase buried in forgotten ledgers, you can hear the quiet rhythm of something more. Something real. A partnership that didn't need a crown or a wedding to matter. A closeness that refused to die, even when every historian tried to write it out of existence. She got away with it, you think, stepping back into the evening rain. Not with fireworks, not with rebellion, but with grace, with steadiness, with one companion by her side who never blinked when the world turned cold. You're gliding down a polished marble hallway, the air thick with rosewater and incense, the silence broken only by the soft slap of slippers on stone. You're in the Topkapi Palace, Istanbul, heart of the Ottoman Empire, where power whispers instead of shouts and death often comes wrapped in silk. Beyond a curtain of gold-threaded drapes lies the harem, mysterious, misunderstood, and ruled not by sultans, but by women. And at the centre of it all sits Kösem Sultan, calm, lethal, and maybe, just maybe, in love with someone the empire never intended her to touch. Kösem didn't start with power. She earned it the hard way, by being cleverer than everyone else. Born Anastasia in what's now Greece, she was captured and brought to the palace as a slave. You follow her through the layers of the harem, past the eunuchs and concubines and endless etiquette. She learns quickly languages, politics, who to flatter, who to avoid. By 16, she catches the eye of Sultan Ahmed Fahd. By 17, she becomes his favourite, not just a consort, the consort, and eventually the mother of his children. But Kösem is playing the long game, and in this palace where a queen can be deposed by a frown and executed by sunrise, you don't survive unless you have leverage. Historical fact: Kösem Sultan was the first woman in Ottoman history to receive the official title of Valide Sultan, Queen Mother, and act as regent, not just once, but twice. She wielded more direct political power than almost any woman in the empire's history, controlling the throne through her sons and even her grandson. For nearly 50 years she ruled from behind a lattice screen, issuing decrees while the Sultan appeared as the mouthpiece. It was shadow rule, elegant, invisible, and terrifying. But let's talk about her supposed secret, the rumoured lover. Not a sultan, not a prince, a eunuch. Yes, again, this time his name was Mehmed Aga, one of the most powerful black eunuchs in the harem and the chief gatekeeper to the inner palace. He was supposed to protect the sanctity of the harem, to keep men out, guard the concubines, and ensure the Valide Sultan remained untouchable. Instead, people whispered that he touched her heart, and possibly more. Here's your fringe fact. In Ottoman palace records, there are detailed lists of gifts exchanged between Kösem and Mehmed Aga, more than protocol would demand. Silks, jewels, a pair of exquisitely embroidered slippers traced back to her personal treasury. There's no explicit record of romance, but when you see his name appear again and again in her private expenditures, long after his official duties should have been completed, you start to wonder. The scholarly debate here splits sharply. Some historians argue that their relationship was purely political, built on mutual necessity. Mehmed controlled access to the Sultan's private chambers. Kösem needed eyes and ears in every corner of the palace. But others suggest something deeper. Mehmed Aga remained unusually loyal to her, even when the court shifted, and sultans came and went. He defended her against rivals, protected her sons, and according to one fragment of an intercepted letter, once referred to her as the light in a place where no sun reaches. It's either a poetic flourish or a love confession lost in translation. You walk with Kösem through her later years, when the palace begins to turn against her. New sultans rise, her sons, then her grandson, and each reign brings new enemies. Younger consorts challenge her position. Courtiers whisper that the old Valide has overstepped, but Kösem holds on, surrounding herself with loyalists, whispering into the ears of viziers, and still relying on Mehmed Aga to guard her movements. Until the end comes, not with a rebellion or exile, but with a plot carried out from within. Her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, orchestrates her assassination, fearing Kösem will kill her grandson to install a more pliable heir. One night, Kösem is strangled with her own curtain cords, smothered in the shadows of the palace she once ruled. You're there in the quiet afterward, in the high-walled courtyards where the lamps flicker and silence stretches long and cold. Mehmed Aga disappears from the record shortly after. No grand scandal, no trial, just silence. Some say he was exiled, others say he took his own life. Or maybe he was simply erased, because power doesn't always leave behind monuments. Sometimes it leaves behind empty spaces, but Kösem left more than shadows. She changed the very architecture of the empire. Her rule shaped laws, controlled budgets, steered military campaigns. She survived multiple sultans, conspiracies, and childbirths, and if she did all that while holding a secret affection for the man meant to guard, not love her, that's just one more rule she broke on the way to the top. You leave the harem through its narrow corridors, the walls still humming with secrets. 1,000 women passed through here over centuries. Most were forgotten, but Kösem remains, a legend draped in silk and steel. Maybe she loved, maybe she didn't, but she held power with both hands, and if love crept in through a crack in the curtain, well, she got away with that too. You're deep in the jungle now, the air wet and sweet with blooming orchids and the thick perfume of rain-soaked earth. There's a rhythmic thrum of insects, the distant cry of a bird you can't name, and under it all a quiet tension that wraps itself around your ribs. This isn't Europe, or China, or the soft royal courts you've tiptoed through. This is 19th century Madagascar. And waiting for you in a stone palace high above Antananarivo is a queen unlike any other, Ranavalona I. Her name is whispered like a warning, her legacy tangled in cruelty, defiance, and, beneath the blood-stained surface, possibly, a forbidden romance that history tried to bury. Ranavalona is no stranger to danger. She came to power after the death of her husband, King Radamir I, and almost no one expected her to survive, let alone reign. She wasn't the obvious heir. She wasn't even particularly loved, but she was clever, and more importantly, she had allies. Within days of Radamir's death, she outmaneuvered his pro-European advisors, had her rivals eliminated, and secured her throne with brutal efficiency. And once she had it, she didn't let go for 30 years. Historical fact, Queen Ranavalona I is one of the most controversial rulers in African history. Her reign saw a brutal rejection of European influence, including mass expulsions of missionaries, foreign merchants, and even some locals who embraced Christianity. She reinstated traditional rituals, revived ancestral taboos, and enforced a brutal legal system where guilt was often determined by poison trials. You drink the poison. If you live, you're innocent. If you die, well, tough luck. But for all her brutality, and there was plenty, there are cracks in the stone. Cracks where light, and perhaps love, slipped through. You walk through the Queen's private quarters, where the walls are carved with ancient symbols and the air is thick with incense. Standing by the window is a man. Not a court official, not a foreign diplomat, but her personal bodyguard, Rainy Mamonji. A tall, quiet man with sharp eyes and a reputation for loyalty so fierce it bordered on obsession. And here's your fringe fact. Rainy Mamonji wasn't just her protector. He accompanied her everywhere, slept outside her door, ate from her table. There are accounts, few veiled in metaphor, of him entering her quarters late at night, summoned for counsel or reports, but the palace staff knew better than to ask questions. In a court where whispers could get you executed, silence was the sound of survival. Scholars still debate the nature of their relationship. Some insist Ranavalona remained celibate after her husband's death, as a show of divine dedication and authority. Others, though, point to Raina Mamonji's sudden rise in status, titles granted, lands gifted, his family elevated to elite status, and suggest something more personal, even emotional. And then there's the peculiar arrangement of her tomb. Built long before her death, it was designed to include a second chamber, slightly smaller but connected by a narrow passage. It was unusual. Tombs for royalty were solitary affairs, yet Raina Mamonji's name was found etched into stone near that secondary chamber. Subtle, hidden, but deliberate. You're walking beside her now in the thick of her reign, her robes heavy with red and gold, a ceremonial blade tucked at her side as she tours the countryside. Raina Mamonji rides behind her, never more than 10 paces away. He says nothing, watches everything. When rebels appear, he's the first to act. When foreigners plot, he's already listening. He's not just protecting her body, he's protecting something else, something fragile that neither of them will admit. But this is not a fairy tale. Ranavalona was feared for a reason. She executed thousands, sometimes for treason, sometimes for minor violations of tradition. And yet she believed deeply in what she was doing. Her enemies were colonizers, missionaries, and locals who sought to modernize Madagascar under European rules. To her, that was surrender. She chose sovereignty over sympathy, tradition over diplomacy. And Raina Mamonji? He stayed through all of it. You're with her near the end. As age dulls her step, but never her eyes. She still speaks with fire, still rules without apology, but in the quiet moments, when the drums fade and the advisors leave the room, she looks at him, just once, and there's a softness there, a weariness. You wonder if he's the only person who's ever seen it. She dies in 1861, at the age of 83, still on the throne. A new queen takes over, one more willing to negotiate with Europe. Missionaries return, roads are built, traditions begin to bend. And Rainy Mamonji, he fades from the record. His lands are reclaimed. His name vanishes from public ledgers. The second chamber in her tomb is sealed off. But some say he was buried nearby secretly, with rites only a few were allowed to witness. Others claim he disappeared into the hills, heartbroken and furious, unable to serve a crown that no longer belonged to her. Either way, the story ends in silence. And here's the final note. Ranavalona ruled on her own terms. She outlived assassins, ex-lovers, missionaries, diplomats and colonizers. She loved her people, even if they feared her. And if along the way she found a man who saw her not as a tyrant or a queen, but as a woman, complicated, fierce, and occasionally vulnerable, then that secret was hers to keep. You leave the jungle behind with the sound of rain pattering through palm leaves, carrying the memory of a love hidden beneath layers of ritual, violence, and defiance. A love that, like her reign, wasn't easy to understand, but she carried it. All the way to the end, you're standing in a windswept glen, heather brushing your boots, the clouds hanging low over the Scottish Highlands like a thick wool blanket. There's a quiet here, something ancient and private where sound seems to hush itself out of respect. You follow a narrow path up to Balmoral Castle, not the grand, stiff-lipped residence of court pomp, but the private retreat where Queen Victoria comes to breathe. This isn't Buckingham Palace. This isn't the London of endless etiquette and whispered court intrigues. This is her place, her escape. And already you feel it in the air, something softer, something warmer, something that feels, maybe, like love. And waiting at the stables with a polished boot and a polite silence is John Brown, the servant who might have loved the Queen of England and might have been loved right back. Queen Victoria was famously devoted to her husband, Prince Albert. When he died in 1861, her mourning became a national obsession. She wore black for the rest of her life. She shut herself away from court for years, and yet life has a way of creeping back in through the cracks. And in those quiet cracks, John Brown appeared not as a prince, not as a noble, but as a gillie, a Scottish servant tasked with assisting the royal family during their Highland retreats. He was plain-spoken, brash, and refused to bow to anyone, not even the Queen. Historical fact. After Albert's death, Victoria withdrew into near total seclusion, prompting public criticism and fears about the stability of the monarchy. But during this period, she grew remarkably close to Brown. He became not just her attendant, but her confidant, her shadow. He travelled with her, dined privately with her, and had near unrestricted access to her personal quarters. She began signing letters to him as your loving Victoria, not your queen, not HRH. Just Victoria. He called her woman when she annoyed him. Woman in thick Scots, and somehow she adored it. Here's your fringe fact. There were persistent rumours that Victoria and John Brown married in secret. One particularly juicy theory claims they were wed in a private ceremony conducted by a loyal chaplain, with only a handful of trusted staff present. No official records were ever found, but in the 20th century, a sealed letter from Victoria to Brown was discovered, allegedly referencing our bond before God. It's vague. It's mysterious. It's exactly the kind of thing that keeps historians up at night. And here's the scholarly divide. Some insist the relationship was purely emotional, a grief-stricken queen leaning heavily on a familiar presence. Others argue that the closeness went beyond friendship, pointing to their constant companionship, the coded language in her journal entries, and the fury of her family, particularly her son, the future Edward VII, who hated Brown with a passion that wasn't just about class. He reportedly referred to Brown as Mama's lover, not assistant, not servant, lover. You follow Victoria through the halls of Balmoral now, her black gown trailing on the flagstone. She pauses at a small wooden door, the one that leads to Brown's room. No guards posted, no ceremony. She slips in for long conversations, often late at night. She trusts him with everything. Her health, her moods, her letters. He's the only one allowed to speak to her plainly, without flattery or fear. When she rides, he's beside her. When she walks, he carries her shawl. You watch them walk through the Selwoods together. No guards, no chaperones. Just two silhouettes in a cold landscape moving in a rhythm that doesn't need explaining. She laughs with him. A real laugh. The kind no one's heard from her since Albert died. Brown himself never sought power. He refused titles, rarely left Scotland, and avoided the pageantry of court like it was a plague. But that didn't stop the gossip. Caricatures of Mrs. Brown appeared in the newspapers. Pamphlets accused him of whispering into her ear, manipulating her from the shadows. The very idea that a commoner, a servant, could have the Queen's heart made the empire twitch. But Victoria never distanced herself. Quite the opposite. She promoted him, gave him rooms in every royal residence. When he was ill, she personally ordered treatments. When he was insulted by ministers, she rebuked them in writing. "He's the best friend I have in the world," she once wrote. "I cannot do without him." And then, suddenly, he was gone. Brown died in 1883 from pneumonia. Victoria was devastated. Not performatively, privately. She retreated into mourning again, though this time without the ceremony. She ordered a life-size statue of him placed at Balmoral. She kept a lock of his hair. His portrait hung beside Albert's in her private quarters. She had a ring of his too, one rumoured to have belonged to her mother, passed down only to those she cherished beyond protocol. Here's something no one likes to talk about. When Victoria died in 1901, her instructions to her staff were specific, secret, and deeply personal. Alongside her wedding ring from Albert, she requested to be buried with several items belonging to Brown, including a photograph, a lock of his hair, and a small ring he had once given her. These items were placed in her hand, hidden from view. Even in death, she kept him close, closer than history was willing to admit. Edward VII, her son, ordered most of Brown's correspondence and memorabilia destroyed. The statue at Windsor was taken down and placed in storage. It was as if he wanted to erase the man from her memory, from the monarchy, from history itself. But he couldn't, because you're still here, walking the same paths they walked, feeling the soft echo of something deeply human between a queen and a man who never bowed to her crown, only to her grief. So maybe it wasn't a romance. Or maybe it was one of the truest romances history ever tried to redact. A love not built on courtship or seduction, but on years of presence, honesty, and the kind of devotion you only get when there's nothing left to prove. Victoria got away with it because she didn't care whether you approved. She ruled an empire. But with Brown, she was simply a woman in mourning, in need, and possibly in love. You're standing beneath a sweeping marble arch, the Aegean Sea glittering just beyond the gardens, its blue vast and indifferent. This is Athens in the 1870s, where myths of gods and warriors echo in every ruined column, but inside the royal palace, it's much more soap opera than epic poem. You move past tall windows draped in gauze, past oil portraits of stiff kings and sorrowful queens, until you reach her, Queen Olga of Greece. Russian by birth, orthodox by faith, and unflinchingly poised. She sits at a writing desk, pen hovering over delicate stationery, her eyes a little too focused on the words. There's a letter she's rewriting, one she won't sign with her name, and it might be going to a man who isn't her husband. Queen Olga Konstantinovna married King George V of Greece at the age of 16. It was a diplomatic match, Russia's gift to a small, newly formed kingdom desperate for legitimacy. George, originally a Danish prince, was energetic, fair-minded, and unfaithful in the most casual, habitual way. He had mistresses and everyone knew it. Olga, meanwhile, filled the role of a proper consort. Charitable, devout, and capable of bearing 8 children while ignoring palace drama with the skill of a seasoned politician. Historical fact: Olga was widely respected, especially for her work translating Greek religious texts into modern language and establishing hospitals and orphanages. She was known to dress plainly, walk the streets among the poor, and even work directly with nurses during crises. The people adored her, but the palace? It was a cold, formal place, and George's absences, emotional and otherwise, created long shadows. That's where Captain Mikhail Theotokis comes in. A naval officer, dashing, Greek, with Russian roots and ties to both military prestige and court circles. You see them meet for the first time at a banquet. Olga in lavender silk, Mikhail in gleaming dress uniform, both too well trained to do more than smile politely. But over the following years, he begins to appear more often, escorting her during official trips, acting as a cultural liaison during events involving Russian dignitaries. No scandal, of course, nothing overt, but a familiarity develops, a shorthand, a warmth. Here's your fringe fact. Several private letters written by Olga during the 1880s went missing after her death, stored for decades in a Greek royal archive before vanishing during World War II. A handful that were found reference the captain, and include phrases like, "I cannot say more even here," and "Your last letter gave me strength." The phrasing is careful, but in a court where love was monitored like state secrets, even careful words can ignite suspicions. The scholarly debate about Olga's emotional entanglement with Theotokos is ongoing. Some historians brush it off as court gossip inflated by later generations who can't imagine a pious queen having a secret heart. Others argue that Olga's letters, and more tellingly her behaviour, suggest a deep emotional connection with the captain. She began appearing more frequently in naval events that had nothing to do with diplomacy. She personally intervened when he was overlooked for a promotion, and once, when he fell ill, she sent her own physician to care for him, despite the disapproval of her ladies-in-waiting. You're with her now in her private garden, where hedges form neat little mazes and lemon trees scent the air. She's seated beneath a vine-draped pergola, the same desk before her, the same soft urgency in her face. She writes, then pauses, then burns the page. You can't help but notice how often she's alone here, how carefully she avoids being seen with Mikhail, not because she's ashamed, but because she's smart and still a queen. Olga's later years were marked by deep grief. Her husband George was assassinated in 1913, gunned down on a public street in Thessaloniki. His death shocked the nation and shattered any chance of her ever finding freedom from her role. Widowed and older, Olga remained politically active, even briefly acting as regent of Greece in 1920, but she never remarried. She claimed that none could match the king. And yet, she never spoke his name with the same softness she used for the captain. After Mikhail's death, quiet, unremarked upon by court annals, Olga reportedly wore a locket bearing a tiny painting of a naval officer in uniform. Not George, not one of her sons. The details in the portrait are subtle, but the resemblance is enough to raise eyebrows among the few who saw it. The locket was buried with her. You walk with her one last time through the palace in the early morning hours. The servants still asleep, the halls echoing with years she never got to live for herself. She stops near a window, looking out at the sea where Greek ships drift like shadows. Duty is love, she once said in a private memoir, but standing there you sense a different truth. Sometimes love is duty's silent rebellion. Olga's story was never scandalous in the explosive sense. She didn't flee with a lover. She didn't abandon her crown. But in a world where queens were measured by their obedience, she carved out a private defiance, a connection that's never made it to the court records, but lived between the lines, in letters, in glances, in a name spoken only in gardens. She got away with it because she left nothing but questions, and sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones no one can prove, but everyone feels. You're riding beside her now, the wind snapping through your hair, hooves pounding across the Hungarian plains as though the horses are trying to outrun history itself. She rides ahead, fast, reckless, laughing into the chill, her dark hair escaping from under her feathered hat, her slender figure wrapped in a tightly cinched velvet riding coat. This is Empress Elisabeth of Austria, better known as Cixi, and she doesn't so much live as a sip. From duty, from Vienna, from court, from her husband, and maybe, just maybe, into the arms of a man who made her feel free when everything else tried to cage her. Cixi is no ordinary royal. She marries Emperor Franz Joseph III of Austria at just 16, plucked from an obscurity, well, minor Bavarian nobility, and dropped into the ice-cold ceremonial hellscape of the Habsburg court. It doesn't suit her, not even a little. The gowns, the stiff greetings, the crushing formality, and worst of all, her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who treats her more like a delicate vessel for producing heirs than a woman, which, let's be fair, was exactly how most queens were seen in 19th century Europe. Historical fact: Cixi gives birth to 4 children, but loses her firstborn daughter in infancy, and is forcibly separated from her surviving kids for most of their upbringing. Her mental health deteriorates under the pressure. She develops severe eating disorders, obsesses over her appearance, and begins to withdraw from court life entirely. But when she discovers Hungary, something shifts. Hungary becomes her sanctuary. Its people adore her, see her as a liberating figure, a symbol of freedom amid Austro-Hungarian tension. And Cixi returns that affection. She learns the language, wears traditional dress, advocates fiercely for Hungarian interests. And then there's Count Gyula Andrássy, handsome, politically ambitious, and deeply involved in Hungary's push for autonomy. You see them meet in a reception room filled with starched uniforms and uncomfortable chairs. But when he bows, there's something different in the air. Not romance, not yet, but recognition of minds, of purpose, of possibility. Fringe fact, rumours flew that Andrassy was so enamoured with Cixi that he sent her a perfumed glove wrapped in a poem. He denied it. She never commented. But in the following years, their closeness only intensified. He becomes Hungary's prime minister. She becomes the beloved Queen of Hungary, crowned separately with her own coronation ceremony, and throughout it all they remain close, too close some say. Scholarly debate on Cixi and Andrassy remains unresolved. They wrote to each other often, those letters, destroyed or sealed away by the imperial family. Eyewitness accounts describe long private rides, extended stays at Hungarian estates, and frequent meetings behind closed doors. One court official claimed they had a language of their own, and often appeared to understand each other without speaking. But was it an affair? Or simply an emotional lifeline in a world where intimacy was always performance? You follow her through the rose gardens at Gödöllő Palace, the Hungarian residence built just for her. She spends months here, far away from the chilly judgment of Vienna, and Andrassy is often nearby, staying at his estate just down the road. Their paths conveniently cross, often, over breakfast, during long walks, at the stables, sometimes in the evenings when everyone else is asleep, and the moonlight catches the soft flash of her dark skirts as she disappears into a different wing of the house. One of her ladies-in-waiting once wrote in a letter, "The Empress seems most alive in Hungary, and the Count seems to be the reason." Still, no scandal ever officially erupted. Cixi was careful. Franz Josef turned a blind eye, or perhaps didn't need to. He loved her, unconditionally, even as she drifted further away. He tolerated her absences, her silences, her longing, and in return she gave him just enough devotion to keep the marriage intact, on paper. By the 1880s, Andrassy begins to fade from political life. He ages, withdraws, and Cixi, she spirals further into solitude. She travels constantly, keeps no fixed address, veils her face in public, and yet she never stops returning to Hungary, never stops writing in Hungarian, never stops wearing the bracelet he once gave her, a simple piece, engraved on the inside with a date no one ever explained. You're with her on the Italian shore now, years later. She walks alone, cloaked in black, her face hidden beneath a heavy veil. She's almost never recognised anymore. She avoids cameras like they're bullets. Her beauty, once legendary, is now protected like a myth she no longer wants to carry. And that's when it happens. In 1898, in Ginevra, an Italian anarchist stabs her in the chest with a sharpened file. She doesn't realise she's wounded at first. She walks away calmly, collapses minutes later, and dies from internal bleeding. Her killer thought he was striking a symbol of empire. Instead, he killed a woman who had spent her life running from crowns. After her death, her journals are sealed, her letters locked away or destroyed. But Andrassy, his eulogies, both public and private, are oddly quiet, reserved, as if the only grief that mattered couldn't be spoken. You visit her grave now in the Capuchin crypt of Vienna. Franz Josef is buried beside her. The court-approved love story polished and preserved. But somewhere in an old estate in Hungary, there's a faded oil painting of Cixi with a letter tucked behind the frame. The signature reads simply, "Yours always, G." She got away with it, not because no one suspected, but because no one could prove what they felt in every glance. She found a brief rebellion in a man who saw her not as an empress, but as herself, and for a while, on those wild Hungarian plains, she outran history. You're stepping through bomb-shattered hedgerows now, the air thick with smoke, the sound of boots echoing across cobbled alleys soaked in yesterday's rain. It's the 140s, and the world is being torn apart by war, and right in the middle of the storm, in a modest Dutch palace with blackout curtains and creaking floors, a queen sits at her writing desk, surrounded by maps, reports, and a radio that never quite stops humming. This is Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, stubborn, steel-spined, and deeply strategic. But behind all that steel, behind the radio speeches and Churchill's warm praise, there's a whisper, a name, a possible connection that, if you squint, looks a lot like a love story hiding in the fog of war. Wilhelmina had been queen since 1890. She came to power as a child and ruled for decades through threats, crises, and relentless pressure from all sides. She didn't marry until her late 20s, choosing Duke Henry of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, a man whose talents, to put it kindly, did not include fidelity or subtlety. He left her cold. The marriage was political, strained, and mostly ceremonial. She had one child, Juliana, and from there she threw herself into governance, trade negotiations, and, eventually, wartime resistance. Historical fact: during World War II, after the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, Wilhelmina fled to London, where she led the Dutch government in exile. From there, she broadcast radio addresses to her people under occupation, her voice calm, fierce, and unwavering. She was so influential that Hitler called her the only man in the Dutch government. Churchill admired her immensely, and yet while she was commanding from afar, she wasn't entirely alone. Enter a man known in some circles as Captain D, a Dutch military officer and intelligence agent whose full name remains frustratingly elusive in the public record. In several classified Dutch government documents from the early 40s, he appears in Wilhelmina's schedule as a personal advisor and military liaison, officially. Unofficially, he was often the only person allowed in her private quarters during long stretches of the war. They spoke in whispers, walked alone in the palace gardens, and took their meals together more often than not. Fringe fact: a letter from one of Wilhelmina's maids, uncovered years after the war, mentioned seeing the Queen in a state of gentle mirth late one night after walking back from the gardens with the captain. The letter adds, "I believe they held hands, though I dared not stare. I have not seen Her Majesty smile so softly in years." Here's where the scholarly debate gets deliciously murky. Officially, Wilhelmina never took a lover. Her image was tightly controlled, especially during the war, when morale depended on her appearing steadfast, maternal, and above reproach. But several memoirs from resistance leaders and palace staff suggest otherwise. A security officer once noted that the Queen had a particular fondness for the company of one gentleman, who remained by her side far beyond the requirements of duty. You walk with her now through a smoke-darkened hallway in London's Dutch embassy. Her shoes quiet on the carpet, her coat buttoned to her throat. The captain waits just ahead, hat in hand, eyes lowered, but not submissive. They speak in low tones. You catch words like precautions and secure corridor. But it's the way she leans toward him, ever so slightly, that says more than the words. This isn't courtly obligation. This is trust, affection, something blooming in the quiet places between protocol. She would never have admitted it. She was of a generation that viewed emotion as vulnerability, and vulnerability as risk. She ruled from her mind, not her heart, or so she insisted. But even queens need moments of reprieve. And during those brutal, lonely months when her country was occupied, her people starving, and the tide of the war uncertain, that reprieve came in the form of a man who never sought power, only proximity. The captain disappears from the records after 1944. No funeral, no retirement, just gone. Some believe he was killed during a covert operation in France. Others think he was quietly reassigned by British intelligence to another front. There's no gravestone, no service, just a gap where a man used to be. And Wilhelmina? She never spoke of him again. But years later, after her abdication in 1948, she wrote in her memoirs about a trusted soul whose counsel steadied me during the darkest nights. No name, no further explanation. And here's your breadcrumb. Among the few personal items she kept until her death in 1962 was a worn leather cigarette case, supposedly gifted by a Dutch officer during the war. Inside was a folded piece of paper, blank, as if the memory it represented couldn't be written down, only held. You visit her grave at the Nieuwe Kerk in Delft, where she lies beside generations of Dutch royalty. Statues show her in uniform, standing tall, chin lifted. But somewhere, far beneath the stone and bronze, is a woman who loved in the margins, who kept a secret not because she was ashamed, but because some truths are too precious for public display. She got away with it because she never asked for permission, because no one dared question the Queen who outmaneuvered Hitler, defied expectations, and ruled with the kind of quiet force most men couldn't begin to comprehend. And if, in the midst of war, she let one man hold her hand in the dark, that's not scandal, that's survival. You're beneath the crystal chandeliers of a palace built on oil and ambition now, where every corner glints with gold leaf and the echo of high heels on marble is as sharp as any political alliance. It's Tehran, mid-20th century, and the world is shifting, fast. Flashbulbs pop like champagne corks, and royalty is suddenly as much about magazine covers as it is about bloodlines. In the middle of it all stands Soraya Esfandiary-Bakhtiary, Queen of Iran, half German, half Persian, fully magnetic. A woman so beautiful photographers fought over angles, and so modern the monarchy itself couldn't quite keep up. And standing just behind the camera's edge is the question no one dares to ask out loud. After she left the Shah, who, if anyone, held her heart? Let's rewind to the beginning. Soraya marries Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, in 1951. It's a fairy tale in the most cinematic sense. Royal titles, sweeping veils, gala ceremonies that make Hollywood blush. At the wedding, her tiara weighs nearly 5 pounds, and yet the marriage doesn't bring peace. It brings pressure. Pressure to bear an heir, pressure to be Persian enough, queenly enough, fertile enough. And when she fails to conceive, the whispers begin, slowly at first, then louder. And finally, inevitably, Soraya is pushed out of the palace she once lit like a chandelier herself. Historical fact, Soraya was declared infertile in 1958 after 7 years of marriage. Despite her protests, the Shah began discussions to take another wife who could provide an heir. Divorce followed swiftly after. Soraya was 25. Here's your fringe fact. Following her exile from court, Soraya moved to Europe, not quietly but glamorously. She graced red carpets, sat front row at fashion shows, even dabbled in film. Federico Fellini offered her a role. She socialised with stars and intellectuals, a glittering exile whose heart seemed to beat somewhere between Rome and Paris. And that's where the real rumours begin. His name was Franco Indovina, Italian, a film director. Not noble, not royal, just brilliant, brooding, and very, very not the Shah. They met on a film set in the early 60s. You see them now through a haze of cigarette smoke and espresso steam in a Roman cafe. Her eyes bright, his laugh low. They lean in close, not because the cafe is loud, but because they want to be closer. It's different than what she had before. No trumpets, no guards, but just two people sitting in the middle of a city that doesn't care who they are. Scholarly debate around Franco and Soraya doesn't revolve around whether they were lovers. Everyone assumes they were. It's about how serious it became. Did she ever consider marrying him? Did she regret giving up the only title that protected her in order to have this brief, sweet freedom? She never said. But her letters from the time are full of aching, intimate language. In one surviving note she writes, "You see me, not the crown, and yet I still feel royal when you look at me." They lived together, off and on, for several years. She stayed in his apartment, far from the flashbulbs. No tiaras, no servants, just scripts, wine, and mornings tangled in linen. For once, she wasn't a queen. She was just Soraya, and she adored it. She said in an interview once that being a queen was like wearing armour beneath chiffon. But with Franco, she claimed, I could finally breathe, until she couldn't. In 1872, Franco Indovina boarded a flight for Sicily. The plane crashed shortly after takeoff, no survivors. Soraya received the news alone in a Paris hotel. She didn't speak publicly for weeks. When she did, it was only to say, I have lost the only man who ever made me forget I was once a queen. You walk with her now through the quiet streets of Paris in the 1980s, her hair silvering, her style still impeccable, but her eyes dulled in a way that suggests something inside never quite stitched itself back together. She remained close to her brother, kept a few friends, occasionally attended charity events, but something shifted after Franco's death. She became a figure of whispered tragedy, the once glamorous queen who never found her footing again. Yet she never denied her past. Her apartment was filled with photographs, her in regal gowns, yes, but also casual Polaroids of her and Franco on the Amalfi Coast, laughing, messy, human. She kept a single rose pressed in a book of Italian poetry on her nightstand. A small gesture, and yet somehow louder than any royal decree. When she died in 2001, alone in her Paris apartment, few people noticed at first. It was only days later that her story resurfaced. Tabloids speculated, old photographs resurfaced, and a quiet collective sigh swept across those who remembered. She was buried in Munich, not Tehran, not Rome. But in her will she left instructions for a final poem to be read aloud. I loved the sky more than the throne, and that's how she got away with it. By refusing to collapse under expectation. By walking away when the crown became a collar. By trading marble palaces for balconies in Rome, and royal processions for scooter rides through back alleys with a man who kissed her, like she was more than just a footnote in someone else's history. You step away from her story quietly, like exiting a cinema long after the credits have rolled. And you realise she didn't flee scandal, she lived beyond it, and for a little while she loved like no queen was ever supposed to. You're stepping into a palace that no longer exists, not the way it once did. The air smells of jasmine and memories, and the faded echoes of court music seem to cling to the walls. This is Tehran in the late 1970s, just before the storm, before the revolution, before the photographs of palaces were replaced with smoke and slogans. The centre of it all stands a woman poised like a sculpture, dignified, elegant, and watched from every angle. This is Farah Diba, the last empress of Iran. Her beauty is effortless, her grace unshakable, and her life impossibly complicated. Because love for Farah was never the scandal, it was the silences in between. She was born into the privileged class of 1940s Iran, educated in Paris and married the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in 1959. She was his third wife, younger, brilliant, and politically palatable. The nation adored her. Western media fawned over her fashion. And more importantly, she did what his previous wives hadn't. She gave him a son and heir. For that alone, she was deemed a national treasure. But Farah was more than a womb in a gown. She took a genuine interest in culture, education, and women's rights. She built museums, she supported artists, she read books no one expected her to understand, and for a while she made being empress look almost effortless. Historical fact: Farah was officially crowned Shah Banu, or Empress, in 1967, the first Iranian queen to receive that title since the fall of the Persian Empire. She was more than a consort. She was a co-ruler in spirit, if not in title. Her opinions carried weight in political and social reform. Her portrait hung beside the Shah's. But behind the pageantry, the marriage began to shift. The Shah was aging, his health declined, his circle grew tighter, more paranoid. Political unrest bubbled up. Farah found herself navigating a crumbling monarchy, a husband increasingly isolated, and a nation ready to burn everything down just to feel free again. And somewhere in all of that, perhaps in those quiet moments between flights, between funerals, between protests, was a man whose name history never quite pinned down. Here's your fringe fact. In the late 1970s, whispers swirled through diplomatic channels and royal gossip columns alike about a European gentleman who had grown unusually close to the Empress during her time abroad. He was said to be an advisor of sorts, on cultural matters supposedly, but he travelled with her often, spotted beside her in Rome, in Paris at private exhibitions, never introduced formally, never acknowledged in public statements, but always there. The scholarly debate is quiet here, out of respect or fear. No one can agree. Some claim he was nothing more than a family friend, a fellow intellectual, a harmless confidant in a time of chaos. Others argue the body language in certain photographs, the notes scribbled in the margins of her travel journals, and the fact that this man seemed to vanish completely after the revolution, all point to something more. You're with her now in exile, after the monarchy's collapse. The Shah and Empress are shuffled from country to country, no nation willing to host them for long. They live out of suitcases, endure diplomatic slights, and watch from afar as Iran redefines itself, without them. The Shah grows weaker, Farah grows quieter. When he dies in Egypt in 1980, she becomes a widow in exile, stateless, titleless, but still regal. And then, for the first time, she's alone. It's here that things become even more private. Farah moves between France and the US, living in quiet corners far from the royal stage. She writes a memoir, gives interviews, supports Iranian artists and authors, but never remarries, never speaks of romance again. Her children grow up scattered across continents. Tragedy strikes. Her youngest daughter Layla dies in 2001 of suicide. Her youngest son Alireza takes his life in 2011. The grief is unimaginable. Through it all, Farah remains composed, but every now and then, you hear a note of something else in her voice. A flicker of warmth when speaking of old friends. A half smile when asked about her time in Paris. Her fondness for poetry and paintings that focus on longing, on stillness, on absence. One painting in her home, framed in ornate gold, is titled La Discrétion. The artist is unnamed. The subject, a woman turned away from the viewer, standing at a window, waiting. When asked about it, Farah only said, "It reminds me of a place that never had a name. You walk with her through a garden now in the south of France, the light is soft. The lavender blooms sway gently in the breeze. She moves slowly but not delicately. Still straight-backed, still elegant. There's no security detail, no photographers, just a woman with too many memories and just enough silence to protect them. She never confirms the rumours, never feeds them, but she also never denies them, maybe because she never had to. Maybe because some love stories are meant to stay where they began, in the quiet. She got away with it because there was nothing to get caught in. No affair, no scandal, just possibility. She held her dignity like a shield and buried her secrets where no one could dig, beneath legacy, loss, and the soft hush of exile. And if someone once called her name in the dark and made her feel for a moment, not like an empress, but just Farah, woman, wife, soul, well, that was her treasure to keep. You're in a different kind of palace now, one without marble, without thrones, without oil paintings of long-dead ancestors staring down in judgment. This one's all sharp edges and smooth white walls, soft linen and carefully curated silence. You're in Tokyo, late 20th century, and the Empress sits cross-legged on a tatami mat, head slightly bowed, a ceramic tea bowl cradled in her hands. This is Michiko Shoda, the first commoner to become Empress of Japan, and her story is quiet, but not empty. Because even here in the strictest of palaces, where rules are etched deeper than emotions, there are whispers that one woman, once upon a time, loved someone she never married, and never quite forgot. She was born into privilege but not royalty. Her family owned a successful flower company, she was educated at the best schools, even studied literature and languages at university. She was brilliant, composed, and strikingly modern for 1950s Japan. And when Crown Prince Akihito met her on a tennis court in 1957, yes, really, it sent the nation into a frenzy. Not because she was dazzling, she was, or well-educated, she was that too, but because she wasn't from the aristocracy. The imperial household hadn't married a commoner in, 1300 years. Historical fact, Michiko's courtship with Akihito sparked public fascination and deep imperial anxiety. Newspapers fawned over her style and intellect. Traditionalists fumed. Some members of the imperial family reportedly wept at the idea of a non-aristocrat becoming future empress. But the match proceeded, and in 1959, Michiko married into the chrysanthemum throne. What came next was decades of public smiles and private claustrophobia. The imperial household agency dictated every aspect of her life. What she wore, what she said, where she walked, even how she mothered her children. She was monitored, critiqued, and pushed to the brink. She reportedly suffered multiple nervous breakdowns, and at one point lost her voice completely for several months. Publicly, this was blamed on exhaustion. Privately, it was understood she was being crushed under the weight of unrelenting formality. And yet, here's your fringe fact. Just before she met Akihito, Michiko had been writing letters to someone. A pen pal of sorts, though that term doesn't do it justice. The man was never publicly identified. But several of her university friends recalled a classmate from her literature circle who exchanged poetry with her for over a year. His letters were quoted in whispers, gentle, layered with metaphor, lines like, "Even the mountain wind cannot scatter what has rooted in silence." Michiko reportedly carried one of his poems in her diary well into her marriage. The scholarly debate naturally is divided. Was this youthful flirtation, or a genuine romantic connection? Could a future empress have had a love affair, emotional, maybe intellectual, possibly even physical, before her engagement? Japan's imperial household has never allowed such questions to breathe in the open air, but there are clues if you know where to look. In interviews later in life, carefully scripted ones, Michiko would occasionally quote obscure poets, names few people remembered. But scholars of Japanese modernist literature recognized them. Poems often published in early university journals, one of which featured work from that anonymous male classmate. He was never famous, never published again. He left Tokyo for rural Japan shortly after Michiko's engagement. No one ever traced him directly to her, but in 1968 he wrote a single essay under a pseudonym titled "The Paper Bird Never Lands." In it he writes, "There are silences louder than thunder, and farewells spoken only by staying away." The entire piece reads like a goodbye wrapped in shadows. You walk with her now through the palace gardens, carefully manicured and impossibly serene. She walks alone, often did, even during her most public years. In old photos, she's always perfectly poised, but her eyes, they carry something else, something unmoored, a loneliness so subtle you'd miss it if you weren't paying attention. Akihito adored her, by all accounts. He supported her, defended her against the stricter elements of court life, even took steps to modernise the monarchy during his reign. Their marriage survived political pressures, personal trials, and the unrelenting microscope of national expectation. But marriage doesn't always erase the ghosts that came before it, especially the quiet ones. Michiko never gave interviews about her youth, not beyond what the imperial household approved, but in her 70s, she helped publish a small collection of her own translations of poetry. Included among them was a single original verse, unattributed. The snow fell so soft it did not know it was melting until it was gone. That's it. No context, no explanation. Just a 3-line memory folded into a book about other people's words. You sit with her now on a wooden bench beneath a cherry tree. She watches the petals drift down like rain. Everything about her is still. Her hands, her breath, her past. She doesn't speak of scandal, she doesn't need to. Because for a woman raised in a culture of silence, love didn't need to scream to be real. She got away with it not by breaking the rules, but by folding the rules around herself like origami. Delicate, complicated, unfoldable once bent. And if there was someone, once, who saw her before the crown and spoke to her in verses instead of orders, then she carried that with her. Not as rebellion, but as remembrance. You're walking now through long shadows cast by an empire that never fully died. It just changed names, changed faces, changed capitals. You're in Moscow in the early 1700s, where frost clings to window panes like old regrets, and the scent of birch smoke winds through the corridors of the Kremlin. The halls are colder here, grander, yes, but carved from stone and silence. And seated at the centre of it all, beneath a heavy fur cloak and 1,000 unspoken secrets, is Catherine of Russia, Not the great, that comes later, but the first, the forgotten one, the impossible one. A woman who began life as a servant and somehow became empress, lover, ruler, and according to every rule in the book, she should never have gotten away with any of it. She was born Marta Skaronska, likely in modern-day Latvia or Lithuania, to a poor peasant family, orphaned young, illiterate, and entirely unremarkable to the outside world until fate flung her into the orbit of Peter the Great, first as a servant in his household, then as his mistress, then as something more. Not a consort in title, at least not yet, but a force, a stabilizer, the calm in his storm. Historical fact, Peter the Great was volatile, brilliant, terrifying, and completely captivated by Catherine. He met her when she was still serving in the household of a nobleman, and within months she was living in his household, bearing his children and accompanying him on military campaigns. When Peter fell into one of his infamous rages, it was Catherine who could bring him back. When his advisors failed, when his generals faltered, she remained quietly indispensable. Peter married her officially in 1712, scandalizing the court by elevating a woman with no noble blood, no education, no pedigree. But he didn't care. He gave her diamonds, he gave her power, he gave her his throne, literally, naming her co-ruler in his final years. She became the first woman to rule Imperial Russia in her own name, after Peter's death in 1725. But that's the official story. Here's your fringe fact. During Peter's long absences and military campaigns, Catherine was rumoured to have developed a particularly close relationship with one of his top field marshals, Alexander Menshikov. He was Peter's childhood friend, trusted advisor, and according to some gossips, a little too trusted by Catherine. Menshikov rose swiftly in the ranks alongside him. He was handsome, charming, and not shy about showing deference to the woman who could command the Tsar's attention and later command the court herself. They were often seen together in private conversation. Their correspondence, some of it surviving, is unusually familiar, playful in tone, and occasionally veers into the vaguely suggestive. "I shall not speak of your bieshu," Menshikov once wrote, "nor shall I say what it reminded me of, though it made sleep difficult that night." That's not how most field marshals talk to their empress. Scholarly debate swirls around their closeness. Some insist their bond was purely political, two survivors clinging to each other in a storm of court intrigue. Others believe they were lovers, or at the very least that Menshikov hoped they might be. And Catherine, she never denied him, never distanced herself. Even after Peter's death, when she could have cast him aside, she elevated him even further, naming him as regent for her grandson, giving him enormous power, ignoring every warning from her advisors. You see them now on a winter evening standing on a balcony overlooking the frozen Moskva River. He lights a pipe. She takes it from his hand and inhales. It's not romantic exactly, it's something older, deeper. The kind of intimacy you build in foxholes and midnight war councils. He calls her by her old name, Marta, when no one else can hear. Eventually, of course, the court turned. Menshikov grew too powerful, too confident. After Catherine's death in 1727, he was exiled within the year. His enemies rejoiced. His estates were seized. But Catherine's affection had protected him until the very end. She left behind no diary, no confessional letters, no grand proclamations of love, only actions, elevations, soft favours dressed in the armour of statecraft. And here's the final twist. Catherine died mysteriously, officially from illness, unofficially from excess, too much power, too much wine, too much trying to rule a court that hated everything about her origins. But even as her health faded, she never relinquished her position. She ruled until the last day, and in her chambers, a painting of Menshikov, not in uniform but smiling, relaxed. The portrait had no frame, it hung behind a velvet curtain, visible only when drawn aside. You walk with her through the final hallway now, the oil lamps flickering low, the frost creeping across the glass. She breathes heavily but steadily. She knows what she's built can't last. They'll erase her, twist her, call her a servant who got lucky. But she knows better. She didn't just love Peter. She learned from him. She outlasted him. And maybe, just maybe, she allowed herself a private rebellion. A second love, hidden in plain sight. She got away with it by mastering the one thing court life never expected of her. Subtlety. She didn't seduce power. She married it, managed it, and when no one was looking, she gave just a little of it away to the one man who called her by her real name. So when the snow falls in Moscow, heavy and soft, and the golden domes vanish behind a curtain of white, remember, somewhere under all that cold history is a woman who ruled with her heart wrapped in iron and velvet. And maybe, when no one was watching, she slipped the velvet back just long enough to feel. And now, here you are, lying in the dark with your blanket tucked just right and the gentle hum of your thoughts beginning to settle. We've wandered through centuries of power and intrigue, across continents and empires, into candlelit bedrooms and secret gardens, into palaces with too many mirrors and hearts with too few safe corners. You've ridden with queens who refused to sit still, who bent tradition into strange origami animals, who loved fiercely, quietly, or not at all, but always on their terms. Some of them ruled from behind curtains, others faced down enemies from horseback. A few smiled politely through unbearable silences. They weren't always kind, they weren't always wise, but they were alive, fully, complicatedly, quietly defiant in the spaces where history expected stillness. Because love, real, secret, messy, forbidden love, isn't about perfection, it's about rebellion. Not always loud, not always scandalous, but real. And whether it was a eunuch in the harem, a naval officer in a coastal kingdom, a poet in a Japanese dormitory, or a filmmaker behind a Roman camera lens, each of these women reached out just once beyond what they were supposed to want, and they got away with it. Not because they were untouchable, but because they were unwritten. They left us just enough pearls, poems, glances in portraits to wonder. And in that wondering they live on, maybe not as heroes, maybe not as lovers, but as something better, human, complicated. Worth telling stories about at night when the lights are low and the questions don't need answers. So now, let the last of the history melt into dreams. You've travelled far tonight, across dynasties and through locked doors, and if your heart feels a little heavier, a little fuller, that's just the echo of lives lived off the record. Sleep well, time traveller.